Section 1. The Springfield Psychiatric Ward Mass Psychosis, Hidden in Plain Sight. There is a moment in a very early episode of The Simpsons, one that most people have seen dozens of times without ever really seeing it, where a background character turns to face the camera. He is standing near the back of a crowd scene, half obscured by a telephone pole, and his expression is wrong. Not wrong in a funny way. Not wrong in the exaggerated, rubbery way that Simpsons characters are always slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that feels deliberate. His eyes are set too far apart. His mouth is pulled into a smile that has nothing to do with joy. And he is staring at something just slightly to the left of the viewer, at something that nobody else in the frame seems to be able to see. He is there for less than 2 seconds. No one ever mentions him. No one ever will. Welcome to Springfield. If you have spent any serious time watching The Simpsons, not just the classic Golden Era episodes that everyone loves, but the full run, the background details, the throwaway gags, the one-line jokes that are over before your brain has fully registered them, then you have probably noticed that something is deeply, quietly wrong with this town. Not wrong in the way that animated sitcom towns are always a little wrong, where the rules of reality bend to serve the joke and then snap back to normal at the start of the next episode. Wrong in a way that accumulates. Wrong in a way that builds on itself across decades of storytelling until the weight of it becomes almost impossible to ignore. Springfield has a psychiatric ward. This is not a secret. The show mentions it openly, references it casually, uses it as a punchline, and then moves on. But if you pay attention, if you actually sit with the implications of what the show has been quietly telling you for more than 30 years, the Springfield Psychiatric Ward stops being a background detail and starts being something that explains an enormous amount about the town, its residents, and the particular flavor of wrongness that saturates every frame of this show. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is stranger than most people remember. The first few seasons of The Simpsons are remarkable for a quality that the show gradually moved away from as it evolved into something more self-consciously surreal. They are grounded. They are, in important ways, realistic. The family dynamics have genuine emotional weight. The school scenes reflect something that actually resembles the experience of childhood in an underfunded public school. The community of Springfield, in those early seasons, has the specific texture of a real American town. Its politics, its social hierarchies, its economic anxieties, its religious life, its civic dysfunction. These things are exaggerated for comic effect, but the exaggeration is applied to a base that is recognizably real. And in that grounded, realistic early Springfield, the psychiatric ward appears. Not dramatically, not as a plot point, but as a background reference, in the way that real communities refer to their institutions casually, assumed to be known, present in the social consciousness without requiring explanation. Someone mentions a relative who was hospitalized there. A character makes a joke whose setup requires the audience to understand that this is a town where psychiatric hospitalization is a known feature of the social landscape. The ward exists in those early seasons the way real institutional presences exist in real communities, slightly uncomfortable to acknowledge directly, but too present to pretend doesn't exist. The first time we see any substantial engagement with institutionalized mental health care in Springfield, it is still subtle enough that it barely registers. But the show keeps returning to this idea, again and again, in different forms, through different characters, always treating it as a punchline, but always, if you look closely, revealing something underneath the joke that isn't funny at all. The Springfield Psychiatric Ward, sometimes referred to as Calmwood Mental Hospital, sometimes as just the institution, sometimes not named at all, which is itself interesting, is a place that an extraordinary number of Springfield residents have either visited, been committed to, or have some personal connection with. For a mid-sized American town of uncertain population, the sheer density of characters with documented psychiatric histories is staggering, and the density is not random. It clusters around specific character types, specific kinds of family structures, specific life histories that have the specific shape of trauma transmitted across generations. This is not how a show produces its background details unless someone, at some level, is thinking about what those details mean. Consider the residents of Springfield and what we actually know about their mental states. Homer Simpson, the show's protagonist, has been evaluated by psychiatric professionals on multiple occasions. He has displayed symptoms consistent with a variety of conditions, depending on which episode you're watching and which joke the writers needed to land. He has grandiose delusions, poor impulse control, an inability to plan for the future, violent outbursts. Scenes that are played for laughs, but that, in any realistic assessment, involve Homer physically assaulting members of his family in ways that real families would define as domestic violence. He has a fundamental disconnect from the emotional reality of the people around him. He makes decisions based on immediate gratification with a consistency that suggests an actual impairment in his capacity for delayed satisfaction rather than just a comical character flaw. In one famous episode, a doctor discovers a crayon lodged in Homer's brain, having been shoved there during childhood, and the removal of the crayon temporarily transforms Homer into a person of extraordinary intelligence and emotional sensitivity. He becomes, briefly, someone who can feel what others feel and understand the complexity of situations and make decisions that reflect genuine consideration of future consequences. He becomes, in short, someone who is not impaired by a piece of construction material in his frontal lobe. When Homer chooses to have the crayon reinserted, it is played as a sweet ending. A man voluntarily choosing to remain cognitively impaired because the impairment makes him a better fit for his social world, because his unimpaired self is too painful to be, because the gap between what he could be and what Springfield permits him to be is too great to navigate. The laugh track runs. The episode ends. Nobody talks about what just happened. What just happened is that the show demonstrated, explicitly and with real clarity, that Homer's defining characteristics, the impulsiveness, the emotional unavailability, the chronic failure to learn from consequences, the inability to sustain complex reasoning are the product of a physical injury, a foreign object in his brain, and that when that injury is removed, a different person is available, a person who feels things more acutely, who understands his impact on others, who is genuinely capable of the kind of emotional and intellectual engagement that his role as husband and father actually requires. And that person chooses to re-impair himself. Because Springfield cannot contain him in that state. Because his authentic, unimpaired self is incompatible with the social reality that surrounds him. Because the gap is too large and the cost of bearing it is too high. This is one of the most quietly devastating things in the entire run of the show, and it was played for laughs, and it worked. Because the comedy was real, and the devastation was also real, and they occupied the same space, which is what The Simpsons has always been best at. But let's stay with the ward, because the ward is the key. The Springfield psychiatric ward appears most explicitly in a handful of episodes, but its presence is felt throughout the series in a way that rewards close attention. What makes it worth examining is not any single appearance, but the pattern, the way the show keeps returning to it, keeps seeding it into the background of Springfield's civic life, keeps treating psychiatric institutionalization as a normal, unremarkable feature of this town's landscape. In a typical mid-sized American city, a psychiatric hospital is a specific institution, a distinct place with its own identity, the kind of place that residents are aware of in the abstract but rarely think about directly. In Springfield, the psychiatric ward seems to be woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that goes well beyond typical. Characters reference it the way they reference the DMV or the local grocery store. It is simply there, the way everything in Springfield is simply there, present, and unremarked upon. A fixed feature of the background against which all the comedy plays out. The question worth asking is, why does Springfield need a psychiatric ward at all? Not in a narrative sense, clearly the show needs it because it provides a useful location for certain kinds of jokes. But within the logic of Springfield as a place, why does this town, which is presented as an ordinary American suburb, have a psychiatric facility that is apparently so heavily used that multiple main and supporting characters have personal familiarity with it? One answer is that Springfield is simply exaggerated for comic effect, and the density of psychiatric history among its residents is part of the exaggeration, a stylistic choice that makes the show funnier. This is almost certainly the intended reading. But there is another reading. One that the show has been quietly building toward for decades without ever committing to it directly. Springfield may be a town with a serious, chronic, and largely unaddressed mental health crisis. The evidence, when you compile it, is overwhelming. Not just the psychiatric ward itself, but the things that surround it. The background details, the throwaway lines, the jokes that stop being funny when you think about them too hard. Take the water. Springfield's water supply has been a running background concern throughout the series, almost always treated as a joke. The water comes from a source that is downstream of the nuclear plant. The nuclear plant, operated by the villain-adjacent Mr. Burns and staffed by Homer Simpson, has a safety record that is, to put it charitably, poor. There are episodes where the water glows. There are episodes where mutations are treated as unremarkable. There is a recurring visual gag about the river that runs through town, a river that, in a real town, would be the subject of serious environmental concern and probably federal intervention. In Springfield, it is a punchline about the town's general dysfunction, used and then moved past. And then there is the Simpsons movie, which builds its entire plot around the premise of Springfield's environmental contamination, reaching a crisis point severe enough to attract federal attention, to produce visible, dramatic physical changes in the local ecosystem, to require the EPA's intervention at a scale that involves literally enclosing the town under a glass dome to contain the contamination. This is played as an adventure plot. It is also, if you take it seriously as a piece of information about Springfield's environment, genuinely alarming. The movie's premise requires the audience to accept that Springfield's contamination level is so severe that it represents a national environmental emergency, requiring the physical containment of an entire town's population. What has the water been doing to the people who have been drinking it for their entire lives? There is a well-documented real-world relationship between chronic environmental contamination and neurological and psychiatric outcomes. Lead in drinking water, one of the more publicized examples from recent American history, produces cognitive impairment, poor impulse control, difficulty with long-term planning, and increased rates of behavioral problems. These are effects that accumulate over time, that are more severe with longer exposure, that are more pronounced in populations with greater exposure. Certain industrial chemicals produce anxiety disorders, mood dysregulation, sleep disruption, and cognitive impairment. Radiation exposure at low but sustained levels affects neurological function in ways that are still being studied. The specific combination of substances that a nuclear plant's leakage introduces into a watershed is not well understood, partly because the combinations are complex and partly because the epidemiological research is difficult to conduct on human populations. The show tells us that Springfield's water is contaminated. It tells us that the contamination comes from the nuclear plant. It tells us that this contamination has been ongoing for the duration of the show's existence. And it tells us separately, across many episodes, in many jokes and plots and background details, that Springfield's residents display patterns of cognitive and emotional impairment that are consistent with the kind of chronic, low-level neurological disruption that environmental contamination of this type produces. Poor impulse control, difficulty with planning, unusual affect, social disinhibition, the kind of low-grade collective irrationality that makes Springfield Springfield. The show has never connected these dots explicitly. It has probably never intended to connect these dots. But the dots are there, laid in by 30-plus years of writers making individual jokes about individual things, and if you step back and look at the overall picture, you see something that the sum of those jokes was never meant to suggest, but somehow does anyway. You see a town that has been slowly poisoned, that doesn't know it has been slowly poisoned, and whose residents' collective cognitive and emotional impairment is treated as a charming quirk rather than a public health catastrophe. The psychiatric ward, in this reading, is not a background detail. It is the town's only visible response to its own invisible crisis. It is the place where the residents who fall off the far end of the spectrum, the ones whose impairment crosses whatever threshold the community has implicitly set for tolerable dysfunction, get processed and returned to circulation. The ward exists at the exact same remove from the center of civic life as the nuclear plant. Always present, always slightly visible, never quite in focus. Let's talk about some specific characters, because the individual portraits are where the pattern becomes most vivid. Ned Flanders is one of the most psychologically complex characters in the series, in a way that the show has been remarkably consistent about, even as it plays him primarily for comedy. Ned is Springfield's most devout Christian, its most civic-minded citizen, its most patient neighbor. He is also a man who, we eventually learn, had a traumatic childhood. His parents were so thoroughly committed to non-discipline, so philosophically opposed to structure, boundaries, and consequences that their parenting amounted to neglect in the specific way that over-permissiveness can become neglect. By failing to provide the framework that children need to develop the capacity for self-regulation, Ned spent the formative years of his development without the external structure that, when properly internalized, becomes the ability to manage one's own impulses and emotions. He carried into adulthood a child's unprocessed rage, unexpressed, because expression was itself a form of transgression in the family system he was raised in, because his parents' permissive philosophy made any negative emotion on Ned's part feel like a violation of the family's fundamental values. The suppression compounded for decades, the rage accumulated, and eventually it erupted. In one of the show's most memorable scenes, Ned's breakdown at Rancho Relaxo, his collapse into expression, his temporary loss of the persona that had been doing the suppression work. He went to a psychiatric facility. He was treated. He came back. The show treats Ned's breakdown and recovery as a completed narrative arc. He went to the ward. Something happened there. He emerged with his characteristic cheerfulness recalibrated and his functioning restored. The ward worked, in the sense that the show requires the ward to have worked. It produced the specific outcome that allows Ned to continue being Ned, to continue serving his function in the show's ensemble, to continue being the good neighbor and the comic foil and the specific presence that the show needs him to be. But here is what the ward did not do. It did not address the childhood trauma. It did not address the decades of suppression. It did not change the conditions, the ongoing stress of being Ned Flanders, the relentless demands of his piety, the proximity to Homer, the loss of his wife, the raising of his children that produced the breakdown in the first place. It adjusted the expression of his distress until the expression fell within tolerable parameters, and then it sent him back. Back to the same neighborhood, the same next-door neighbor, the same civic obligations and religious commitments and daily demands that he had been managing before the breakdown by suppressing everything that couldn't be expressed. This is the ward's pattern, visible across multiple characters. Adjust, return, continue. The root causes remain, the conditions remain, the same pressures continue to operate, and the ward cycles through its patients with the efficiency of a system that has been optimized for throughput rather than for healing. Now consider Principal Skinner. Seymour Skinner is a man whose entire adult identity is eventually revealed to be a fiction. He is not actually Seymour Skinner. He is a man named Armin Tamzarian, who encountered the real Seymour Skinner in military service, who adopted the identity of a man he believed to be dead, and who then simply continued living as that man indefinitely, building a career, a community standing, a relationship with Skinner's mother, all on top of a lie that had been running for decades. This is not a minor deception. This is a person who has, for the entire duration of his adult life, presented himself as someone he is not, who has constructed every relationship in his life on a false foundation, who has never in any of his relationships, his professional engagements, his civic participation been genuinely present as himself. The psychological cost of this kind of sustained dissociation is enormous. The effort required to maintain a false identity across decades, to never let the real self surface in any significant way, to manage the constant vigilance that a sustained deception of this scale requires. This is the kind of cognitive and emotional burden that produces specific, documentable psychological damage. And when the truth is revealed, the town's response is to collectively agree to forget it. A judge literally orders everyone to never speak of it again. Springfield's response to the discovery that one of its most prominent citizens has been living a false identity for decades is legal compulsion of collective amnesia. This is played as a joke. It is also the most explicit single statement the show makes about Springfield's fundamental psychological defense. It cannot process difficult truths, so it outlaws them. It does not heal from the revelation of what is false. It simply mandates that the revelation be treated as if it did not happen. The judge's order is absurd. It is also, within the logic of Springfield's psychosocial dynamics, completely consistent with how the town has always operated. The ward processes, the judge orders, Springfield continues, and the things that cannot be processed and cannot be forgotten and cannot be made into a joke that ends with a laugh track accumulate in the background, like everything else in Springfield that is quietly true. Let's talk about the children, because the children are where the generational dimension of this crisis becomes most visible. Bart Simpson is a child in genuine psychological distress. This is not controversial. The show has depicted it explicitly and repeatedly across its run, with varying degrees of seriousness. Bart's distress is real, and its sources are identifiable. A chaotic family environment in which one parent is consistently unavailable due to his own impairments, and the other is loving but stretched thin. A school environment that has failed to engage him in any meaningful way. A community of peers who relate to him primarily through the social dynamic of his reputation, rather than through any genuine connection. and an underlying intelligence and sensitivity that have no appropriate outlet in the specific institutional environment he inhabits. The show has Bart evaluated by psychiatric professionals multiple times. The evaluations are played for comedy, and the comedy is often genuinely funny. But underneath the comedy is a consistent finding. Bart has real problems. The problems have identifiable causes, and Springfield's institutional response to those problems is consistently to address the expression rather than the cause. The medication episode is the most explicit version of this. Bart is prescribed a Ritalin-like drug. The drug makes him docile, cooperative, and easy to manage. The adults around him prefer this version of Bart. The show critiques this preference. Clearly and directly, it is one of the episodes where the show's satirical intent is most obvious. But it also, quietly, acknowledges that the medicated Bart is better for Springfield's purposes than the actual Bart, and that the actual Bart, the child who acts out because he is in distress, the child who needs someone to see him clearly rather than manage him, has no institution prepared to do that work. The ward is not equipped to see Bart clearly. No institution in Springfield is. And this brings us to what may be the most genuinely disturbing thing about the Springfield psychiatric ward. It doesn't work. Not in the sense that it treats people badly or that its staff is malicious. The show doesn't really make that argument. But in the sense that the same people keep cycling through it, or through the same dysfunctional patterns that would bring them there, without anything changing in any fundamental way. Springfield's psychiatric crisis is chronic. It is structural. It is produced by conditions, environmental, economic, social, familial, that the ward has no ability to address, because the ward can only address individuals, and what Springfield has is a collective problem. The water keeps coming from the same source. The plant keeps running under the same management. The same patterns of trauma keep transmitting from parent to child. The fictional Seymour Skinners keep being created and maintained, and then legally protected from scrutiny. And the people who fall off the far end, the ones whose distress becomes too visible, too disruptive, too impossible to ignore, keep cycling through a facility that adjusts their behavior and returns them to the same conditions that produced it. There is a structure to this that goes beyond any individual case. Springfield's psychiatric system is not failing despite trying to address the town's collective problems. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is managing the overflow. It is processing the residents who exceed the system's tolerance threshold for dysfunction and returning them to slightly below that threshold, preserving the system's equilibrium. The system's equilibrium requires the dysfunction to persist. A town without dysfunction does not require a psychiatric ward. A town with a ward that actually resolved its patients' underlying issues would produce patients who did not return. Springfield's ward is, in this reading, calibrated not to cure but to maintain. To keep the population's dysfunction within the range that allows the town to continue functioning as Springfield. This is a deeply uncomfortable reading of what is, in context, a background joke about a cartoon town's civic amenities. But it is the reading that the accumulated evidence supports. The ward has been there for the whole run of the show. The same people have been cycling through it. Nothing fundamental has changed. Because nothing is designed to change. There is a man in a crowd scene in an early episode. He is standing near the back, half obscured by a telephone pole. His eyes are set too far apart. His smile has nothing to do with joy. He is staring at something nobody else can see. He has probably been to the ward. He probably came back. Springfield closed around him again, the way it always does, and he went back to standing in crowd scenes, looking at whatever it is he sees that nobody else can. The show has never explained what he's looking at. It never will. But if you watch enough episodes, if you spend enough time in this town that the animators built and the writers filled and the audience fell in love with, you start to wonder whether the thing he's looking at is the same thing you're looking at when you watch this show closely enough. The cracks, the patterns, the 30 years of jokes that stop being funny when you add them up. The ward exists because Springfield needs it. Springfield needs it because Springfield is sick, and Springfield stays sick because the ward can only fix the symptoms. And the symptoms are Springfield. Before we go any further, if you've made it this far and you're finding yourself looking at this show differently, if the background details are starting to feel heavier than they used to, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment below. Tell me when you first noticed that something was off about Springfield. Tell me the moment, the episode, the background detail that made you look twice. And if you haven't already, subscribe. because what we've covered here is just the beginning, and what's coming in the next sections goes considerably deeper. The mysteries we're going to examine next have been sitting in plain sight for decades. Some of them will change how you see this show entirely. Some of them, honestly, I wish I hadn't noticed. But I did. And now, so will you. End of Section 1. Section 2. The disappeared children of Springfield vanished without explanation. There is a peculiar kind of forgetting that happens in Springfield, and once you start noticing it, it follows you out of the show and into the rest of your day. Characters appear, they are introduced with enough specificity to suggest they will matter: a name, a relationship, a background detail that implies history, and then they disappear. Not dramatically, not with any fanfare or acknowledgement. They simply stop being there. The way a piece of furniture stops being there after you've moved it out of a room, noticed only in its absence and only if you're looking for it. This happens with adults, with supporting characters, with recurring background figures who populate Springfield's civic spaces and then gradually drain away. But it happens most strangely, most persistently, and most disturbingly with children. Springfield has a missing children problem. Not in the sense that the show has ever addressed it as such. Not in the sense that any episode has ever built a dramatic plot around the disappearance of a named child character or treated the absence of Springfield's youth as anything requiring investigation. The show does not present this as a horror. It does not present it at all, which is itself part of what makes it disturbing once you start looking. But if you compile the complete roster of child characters who have appeared in The Simpsons over the course of its run, actually sit down and catalog them, season by season, episode by episode, and then compare that roster against the children who remain present in the show's current or recent seasons, the gap between those two lists is much larger than it should be. The gap contains names and faces and specific relationships that the show introduced with enough deliberateness to imply permanence, and then simply stopped accounting for. Let's begin with the most famous example, the one that the show's most dedicated fans have been discussing for years without ever quite resolving to everyone's satisfaction. Rod and Todd Flanders. Ned Flanders' sons are recurring characters throughout the series. They are Ned's children from his marriage to Maude, who dies in a season 11 episode, a death that is treated with genuine emotional weight, one of the show's more somber moments, remarkable in a show that typically sidesteps genuine grief with the reflexes of someone who has spent their career around open flames. Maude's death is real within the show's logic. It is supposed to matter. It is supposed to change things. Rod and Todd are defined by their father's religiosity, their deliberately sheltered upbringing, their innocent worldview that the show positions as naive in ways that are sometimes poignant and sometimes comic. They are sweet, slightly strange children who provide a recurring contrast with Bart and Lisa, where the Simpson children are worldly, irreverent, and deeply savvy about the specific dysfunction of the world they inhabit. The Flanders boys are genuinely sheltered, genuinely oriented toward the religious framework their father has constructed around them, genuinely unequipped to process the more disturbing realities of Springfield's existence. This contrast is one of the show's most productive recurring dynamics. It has generated some genuinely memorable comedy and some genuinely affecting moments of unexpected tenderness. But here's what happens to Rod and Todd after Maude's death. Almost nothing. And that almost nothing is deeply strange when you sit with it. Maude's death fundamentally changes Ned's circumstances. He is now a widower with 2 young children in a household next door to a family that is, by any reasonable assessment, a daily immersion in everything he has been trying to protect his sons from. The show does explore Ned's grief across several subsequent episodes, with more seriousness and more sustained attention than it applies to most things. Ned's grief is real. The show handles it with something close to respect. But Rod and Todd's experience of losing their mother, the experience of 2 young children watching the person who was the anchor of their family life simply cease to exist, is treated with remarkable brevity. They are sad for a short time. There are a couple of scenes. The show moves on. And over time, as seasons accumulate, Rod and Todd begin appearing less and less frequently until their presence in the show becomes so sparse as to be effectively ceremonial. They exist to be referenced more than they are shown. Their names are invoked more often than their faces appear. They have become characters who are officially still present in Springfield, but who function more like rumors of themselves known to exist somewhere in the town's geography, acknowledged when narrative convenience requires it, absent from the active life of the episodes with a completeness that goes well beyond normal ensemble management. Where do they go? Within the logic of the show's world, Ned continues raising them. They grow up. In the eternal Springfield sense of growing up, which is to say they don't grow up at all, they remain perpetually young in the way all Springfield children remain perpetually young in the house next door to the Simpsons. They attend Springfield Elementary. They remain Bart and Lisa's neighbors. These facts are part of Springfield's established geography, and yet they are not there. They are present in the way a rumor is present, in the way a memory is present, in the way that people who have moved away are present in conversations about them, referenced, invoked, maintained in the social record, but absent from the actual space of the show's active storytelling in ways that become more pronounced with each passing season. This is odd, but it gets considerably odder when you consider it in the broader context of how the show has handled its full population of child characters across its entire run. The show has, across more than 30 years of production, introduced a remarkable number of child characters in contexts that suggest they will be recurring presences, as classmates of Bart and Lisa at Springfield Elementary, as the children of adult characters who appear with some regularity, as participants in the social dynamics of Springfield's youth community. A significant proportion of those characters have simply ceased to exist without explanation, in a way that goes well beyond the normal narrative economics of a long-running animated series. Normal narrative economics would explain some of this. A show that has been running for more than 30 seasons has limited bandwidth for any given character in any given episode. A child introduced in one episode might simply never return because the writers moved on to other things, because the stories they wanted to tell didn't require that character, because the ensemble was already enormous, and adding a recurring presence is a deliberate decision rather than a default. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, how most long-running shows operate. But the pattern in The Simpsons is different in a specific way that separates it from ordinary ensemble management. The children who disappear from the show don't just fail to return in many cases, they fail to return in contexts where their presence is narratively implied by the relationships and settings the show has established for them. They have specific relationships with main characters. They have defined roles in established settings. Their absence from scenes where they should logically be present creates small, quiet holes in the show's fabric, holes that are individually easy to dismiss but that accumulate, over 30 years, into a pattern that is genuinely strange. Let's consider Springfield Elementary carefully, because the school is where this pattern is most densely visible and most consistently documented. Springfield Elementary is the show's primary school setting, and it has been depicted with considerable physical and institutional consistency across the series. The school has a staff, a principal, a student body, and a physical layout that has remained relatively stable over decades of broadcast time. Bart and Lisa have attended this school for the entire run of the show. In that time, they have encountered a large number of named, characterized classmates' children who have been introduced with enough specificity to imply they will be recurring presences in the social world of Springfield Elementary. The show's most durable child characters at the school, Milhouse Van Houten, Nelson Muntz, Martin Prince, and a handful of others have survived as genuine recurring presences. They are part of the established ensemble. Their relationships with Bart and Lisa are ongoing and developing. They appear in current episodes with the consistency of characters who have been claimed as permanent. But around them, in the crowd scenes and classroom shots and playground sequences, there are faces that appear and then disappear. Children who are named in one episode and never named again. Children who are shown as part of an established social group and then absent from that group in subsequent episodes without any account of where they went. Children who have specific relationships with specific main characters, friendships, rivalries, the social bonds that are the primary currency of childhood, and who then simply stop appearing in the context where those relationships would logically be expressed. Consider the character of Lewis. Lewis appears in the early seasons as one of Bart's consistent friends. Not a central friendship, not one of the defining relationships, but a genuine part of Bart's social world. Lewis is black, one of a relatively small number of black child characters in the show's Springfield Elementary scenes during those years. He appears across multiple early episodes with enough regularity to establish him as a recognized face in Bart's social landscape. And then his active presence in the show gradually fades, to the point where he exists primarily as a ghost in crowd scenes rather than as a character with meaningful participation in any story. Why Lewis specifically? Why did the writers maintain Milhouse, Nelson, and Martin while letting Lewis fade? The standard explanation is that those other characters had more clearly defined personalities and more versatile comedic functions. They were better tools for the specific kinds of stories the show wanted to tell. This is probably right in a practical sense, but within the logic of Springfield as a continuous world, it means that one of Bart Simpson's friends simply ceased to exist as a meaningful presence in Bart's life, with no account of what happened to him and no indication that anyone in Springfield noticed or cared about the absence. Lewis's case is illustrative of a broader pattern, and the pattern contains something specific that distinguishes it from simple cast management decisions. The child characters who disappear most completely from Springfield's active social life tend to be characters who were introduced in the show's earlier, more grounded seasons, the seasons before the show fully embraced its more surreal and self-referential register. They belong to an earlier version of Springfield that was slightly more committed to the texture of actual small-town American life, slightly more interested in the realistic emotional dynamics of working-class family and community existence. As the show evolved, as it became more anarchic, more self-aware, more willing to sacrifice internal consistency for a well-executed joke, the characters who belonged to that earlier, more grounded Springfield became increasingly inconvenient. They implied a continuity that the show was moving away from. They were part of a version of this world that was being gradually replaced by something more elastic and less constrained. The children who disappeared are the fossils of that earlier Springfield. They are the traces of a world that the show built and then quietly dismantled over the course of its evolution. And they are fascinating not just because they were dropped, but because of how they were dropped, not written out, not killed off, not sent away, not given any form of narrative acknowledgement. Simply allowed to recede, one episode at a time, until their presence was reduced to a ghost in crowd scenes and eventually to nothing at all. Within the show's own internal world, they still exist. The show never formally removed them, since Springfield is, in theory, a continuous world, a place that persists between episodes, whose inhabitants' lives presumably continue when the camera is pointed elsewhere. The fact that Lewis or any of the other fated children no longer appears on screen does not necessarily mean that Lewis or any of the other fated children are no longer in Springfield. They are simply somewhere the camera doesn't go. This is uncomfortable in a way that is specific to The Simpsons and its particular form of longevity. Most shows don't run long enough for their dropped characters to accumulate into a pattern that is visible and strange. Most shows don't have the kind of detailed, exhaustively documented fan record that The Simpsons has generated over 3 decades. Most shows don't have the combination of longevity, fan engagement, and genuine emotional investment that has made the show's internal contradictions a subject of serious ongoing analysis. The Simpsons has all of these things. And the children who were once present and are present no longer are, if you go looking for them with any seriousness, surprisingly easy to find. Now, let's add a layer that makes this considerably more disturbing. The show's most famous structural feature, the decision not to let its characters age, to keep Bart perpetually at 10 and Lisa perpetually at 8, across decades of broadcast time is usually discussed in terms of what it does for the show's narrative flexibility. It preserves the setting, the premise, the character dynamics. It prevents the characters from outgrowing the roles that define them. These are practical advantages, and they explain the decision in purely commercial and narrative terms. But the no-aging rule creates a specific existential condition for every character trapped within it. They are frozen. Not in the sense that they don't change or grow within individual episodes. The show has always allowed genuine development within the frame of a single story, and it has produced many episodes in which characters learn, change, and are genuinely altered by what happens to them. But they don't retain those changes across episodes. They reset. They are always returned to their baseline, which means they are always returned to the same position of struggling with the same problems, being failed by the same institutions, being hurt by the same dynamics, enduring the same specific quality of suffering, with no accumulation that would eventually transform it into wisdom or escape. Bart has been struggling with school, with authority, with the specific mixture of charisma and self-destruction that defines his character for more than 30 years of broadcast time. He has had breakthroughs within individual episodes. He has been seen clearly by teachers, by coaches, by adults who responded to him in ways that temporarily changed what was possible for him. And then he resets, and he is struggling again. And the breakthrough is gone. and the adult who saw him clearly either doesn't appear again or returns to treating him the same way they treated him before the breakthrough, as if the breakthrough never happened. This is what eternity looks like when it happens to a 10-year-old. Not peace, not stasis, but the endless repetition of the same struggles with no accumulation that would change them. Now consider what this means for the children who used to be present and aren't anymore. They were part of Springfield's eternal present, and then they weren't. They were in the loop, and then they fell out of the loop, and the loop closed around their absence the way Springfield always closes around its absences completely, without acknowledgement, without any visible processing of the loss. The town that does not notice when its water glows, does not notice when its children stop appearing. The community that voted to legally compel itself to forget an inconvenient truth about its principle does not register the gradual disappearance of its youngest members. The psychiatric ward that cycles its patients back into the same conditions does not ask where the children who used to be here have gone. They went somewhere. The show's world doesn't end at the frame's edge. Springfield continues beyond what the camera shows. The children who faded from the active life of the show are somewhere in that continuing world, somewhere in the parts of Springfield that we don't see, in the streets and schools and homes that exist in the background of a town that has been running for 30 years. But nobody is looking for them. Nobody in Springfield is tracking the gap between the children who should be here and the children who are here. Nobody is maintaining the list. That's the most disturbing thing, maybe. Not that the children disappeared, but that Springfield's response to their disappearance is indistinguishable from its response to everything else it doesn't want to see. Complete, practiced, almost reflexive invisibility. The town closes around the absence. The pattern continues, and somewhere, in the parts of Springfield that the show doesn't visit anymore, the children who used to matter go on not mattering, in a town that has perfected the art of not noticing. End of Section 2. Section 3. Sector 7G is a cover-up. What Homer's job actually is. Homer Simpson has worked at the Springfield nuclear power plant for essentially the entire run of the show. He is, depending on which episode you watch, a safety inspector, a technician, a supervisor, a department head, or simply a man who sits in a chair in a room full of controls and occasionally pushes a button when the light turns red. His job title and responsibilities shift with the narrative requirements of any given episode. His competence level varies from barely functional to accidentally genius in ways that serve whatever comedy the writers needed to produce in the moment. And his relationship to the actual operation of a nuclear power plant, to the genuine technical and procedural requirements of working safely with nuclear material, is so abstract as to suggest that he may not be required to understand nuclear power in any meaningful way in order to perform his job. This last point is the one that matters most, and it is the one the show returns to most consistently without ever drawing the conclusion it implies. Homer's job at the plant, specifically his role in Sector 7G, has been consistently presented as both essential to the plant's operation and completely indifferent to his qualifications. Homer has, on multiple occasions, fallen asleep at his safety monitoring station. He has, on multiple occasions, created near disasters through inattention, incompetence, or impulsive decision-making that a competent safety professional would never make. He has openly admitted, across multiple episodes, to not understanding the basic principles of the equipment he is supposed to be monitoring. He has used plant time and resources for personal projects, meals, naps, and pursuits that have nothing to do with nuclear safety. He has made decisions in moments of crisis that, in a real nuclear facility, would have been disqualifying events leading to immediate termination, criminal investigation, and regulatory review. None of this has ever resulted in his termination. Not permanently. Not in any way that stuck. This is played as a joke about Homer's unlikely employment security. It is also, if you sit with it, one of the most genuinely peculiar long-running gags in the history of American television. Because nuclear power plants in the real world are among the most tightly regulated industrial facilities in existence, the personnel who operate and monitor them are subject to rigorous training requirements, background checks, regular competency assessments, psychological evaluations, and the kind of multiple redundant oversight that makes the casual employment of someone with Homer's demonstrated limitations not merely implausible but essentially impossible under any regulatory framework that actually exists. The Springfield nuclear power plant does not operate like a real nuclear power plant. This has been obvious since the first episode that depicted it. It operates like a place that exists to generate jokes about nuclear power rather than to generate nuclear power. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the accumulated detail of 30 years starts pointing somewhere that individual episodes were never designed to point. If Sector 7G is not what it appears to be, if the function Homer actually performs there bears no meaningful relationship to nuclear safety monitoring, then what is it? What does Sector 7G actually do? What is Homer's actual job, stripped of the official description that the show provides and never quite delivers on? Let's start with the physical layout. The sector contains monitoring equipment, a control panel, a chair in which Homer sits for the majority of his workday, and various gauges and instruments whose function is never clearly specified. The aesthetic is pure 1970s industrial. Analog controls, CRT monitors, equipment that was already dated when the show premiered and which has become progressively more anachronistic with each passing year. This anachronism is usually played as a joke about the plant's aging infrastructure and Mr. Burns's resistance to capital investment. But in a real nuclear facility, the failure to update monitoring and safety equipment to current standards would be a regulatory catastrophe. The kind of thing that produces mandatory shutdowns and federal investigations. The plant is not regulated like a real nuclear facility. Its regulatory encounters, depicted in multiple episodes, consistently end with Burns managing his way out of consequences through bribery, political influence, and the demonstrated corruptibility of whatever inspector has been assigned to his case. This is a satirical point about corporate influence over regulatory bodies, and as satire it is effective. But it also establishes, over the course of many episodes, that the Springfield nuclear power plant operates in a regulatory environment that is so compromised as to be effectively non-functional. What does a nuclear facility look like when its regulatory oversight is non-functional? In reality, it looks like one of several real-world cases that have entered history as cautionary tales. It looks like a place where the official documentation bears little relationship to actual operational practices, where the recorded parameters of safe operation are regularly exceeded without consequence, where the gap between what is happening and what is reported to be happening grows over time until the two are essentially unrelated. Homer's official job is to monitor safety parameters and respond to anomalies. If the monitoring systems are as non-functional as the show repeatedly implies, then Homer is not monitoring anything. He is watching a display of data that may bear no relationship to the actual conditions in the plant. He is pushing buttons in response to lights that may not correspond to actual events. He is performing the ritual of safety monitoring without any of its substance. This is either a very dark joke about regulatory capture and corporate negligence, or it is something else. Let's talk about what the plant might actually be doing. Mr. Burns's wealth is the key here. He is depicted as extraordinarily rich, obscenely, historically, cartoonishly rich in a way that his nuclear utility, even a very successful one, would not by itself explain. Nuclear power plants generate electricity, which is a commodity product sold into regulated markets at regulated prices. The economics of nuclear generation are well understood. They produce stable, predictable returns over long operational timelines, but they are not the kind of business that generates the specific kind of dynastic, politically connected, personally powerful wealth that Burns displays. Burns's wealth has the character of extractive wealth, wealth that comes from taking rather than producing, from controlling access to something rather than creating value. The nuclear plant is his visible asset, his public business identity, his explanation for his existence in Springfield. But the wealth he displays is not consistent with a nuclear utility, however well managed, that sells power to a mid-sized American city. What else is the plant doing? What else is it producing, or providing, or enabling that generates the kind of wealth and the kind of power that Burns actually has? The show has placed several hints in the background over the years, most individually dismissible as jokes or production design inconsistencies, but they cluster around a specific set of suggestions that the plant is involved in activities that are not disclosed in its public regulatory filings, that its physical infrastructure is larger and more complex than a simple power generation facility would require, and that certain aspects of its operation are specifically designed to be invisible to external observation. The waste disposal story is particularly interesting. Springfield's waste management, specifically the disposal of the plant's radioactive and hazardous materials, has been connected, across multiple episodes, to Fat Tony's operation. This connection is played as a corruption story, Burns pays the mob to make his waste disappear in ways that avoid proper regulatory disposal. The mob takes the money and dumps the waste somewhere inadequate, which produces the environmental contamination that we've already discussed in the context of the water supply. This is a straightforward corruption narrative, but it is also a disclosure. The plant generates material that cannot be disposed of through legitimate channels, material that requires deniable disposal, material whose very existence, in the quantities implied by the show's recurring waste storylines, raises questions about what the plant is doing to generate it. Nuclear power plants do produce radioactive waste, and its disposal is genuinely one of the more complex regulatory challenges in the industry. But the quantities implied by the Springfield plant's waste management storylines and the specific quality of secrecy attached to their disposal suggest something more than ordinary spent fuel rods. What is Sector 7G producing that requires Fat Tony to make it disappear? Homer doesn't know. Homer has been sitting in that room for decades without knowing. And Mr. Burns has always known that Homer doesn't know, and has always been satisfied with this arrangement. Because Sector 7G needs a presence. It needs someone there. It does not need someone who understands what they're there for. Homer is perfect for this role, not despite his incompetence, but because of it. A competent person in that room would notice things, would ask questions, would eventually understand enough of what they were seeing to become a liability. Homer sees the same things a competent person would see and understands nothing. He is the ideal witness, present, documented, officially accountable, and constitutionally incapable of acting on anything he observes. Sector 7G is a cover. The lights blink, the gauges read whatever they read. Homer eats a donut and nearly falls asleep. Whatever it is that Sector 7G actually does, it keeps doing it, one episode at a time, in full view of a man who cannot see it. End of Section 3. Section 4. Fat Tony's Impossible Empire. The Mob, the CIA, and Springfield's Shadow Government. Every American town of any size has, somewhere in its civic architecture, the invisible structures that run things. Not the mayor, not the city council, not the police chief who appears at press conferences and makes statements about the community's commitment to public safety. The actual structures, the informal networks of money and obligation and mutual interest that determine what gets built and what gets torn down, who gets contracts and who gets indicted, which problems get addressed and which problems get managed rather than solved. Springfield has these structures. It also, unusually, has Fat Tony. Fat Tony, whose actual name is Marion Anthony D'Amico, a detail the show offers and then mostly ignores, is Springfield's resident organized crime figure. He is, like most things in Springfield, played primarily for comedy. A broad parody of Hollywood mob archetypes, speaking in a stylized cadence, conducting his criminal enterprise with a level of theatrical menace that is clearly more interested in being funny than in being frightening. He is a joke character with some surprisingly consistent depth, a figure who recurs throughout the series in a way that, when examined carefully, raises questions about Springfield that the show finds more comfortable to ignore. The first question is the most basic. What is Fat Tony actually doing in Springfield? Organized crime in America is geographically specific. The major crime families that defined American organized crime through most of the 20th century were rooted in specific cities with specific economic landscapes. Their power derived from their ability to control specific economic activities in specific territories: labor unions, construction, waste management, gambling, the waterfront, wholesale food distribution, certain retail industries. The geography of organized crime is not incidental to its operation. It is fundamental. You need a specific place with specific economic activities to control. Springfield is a mid-sized American city of uncertain location with a generic economy. It is not, in any obvious way, the kind of place that would support the kind of organized crime presence that Fat Tony represents. His operation, which appears to include gambling, protection rackets, waste management, labor racketeering, and occasional involvement in legitimate businesses, is scaled for a much larger and more economically complex urban environment. The Springfield mob, as depicted, would require a larger economic base, more diverse revenue streams, and more complex political relationships than a town of Springfield's apparent size and economic profile would support. And yet, Fat Tony is there, operating with remarkable stability and effectiveness, in a town that by all rights should be too small and too economically marginal to sustain his operation. This is the first sign that Fat Tony's presence in Springfield requires an explanation that the show has never provided. Let's examine what Fat Tony actually does in Springfield, beyond the broad comedy of his character. In his recurring appearances, Fat Tony's operation touches an extraordinarily wide range of Springfield's civic and economic life. He is involved in city contracts. The show has depicted him providing services to the municipality that are formally contracted through legitimate channels, but that are structured to benefit his operation disproportionately. He is involved in the disposal of hazardous materials, the nuclear plant connection that we've already noted. He is involved in labor provision for various municipal functions. His relationship with the Springfield Police Department is ambiguous in ways that suggest something more complex than simple corruption. And his relationship with Mayor Quimby, Springfield's perpetual mayor, the show's enduring symbol of machine politics, is long established enough to imply a genuine partnership rather than merely the tolerance of criminal activity by a corrupt politician. Mayor Quimby has been the mayor of Springfield for the entire run of the show, without interruption, without any serious electoral challenge that comes close to unseating him. He keeps winning. He keeps being the mayor. And his relationship with Fat Tony is clearly one of the stable, foundational relationships of Springfield's political order. What does Fat Tony provide to the Quimby administration? The show implies money and electoral assistance, but the scale of Fat Tony's apparent influence over Springfield's civic life suggests that the arrangement goes considerably beyond typical mob politician corruption. Fat Tony appears to have genuine decision-making authority over certain aspects of Springfield's governance. Not in the sense that he attends official meetings, but in the sense that significant things in Springfield, things that should be governed by public processes and institutional decision-making, seem to operate according to an informal structure that has Fat Tony at or near its center. This is a shadow government, and it is worth examining with some care. Consider Chief Wiggum's enforcement pattern. Wiggum's enforcement of Springfield's laws is not random. It is selective in ways that consistently protect specific interests. The crimes that get prosecuted are the crimes of people who are not connected to the informal power structure. The crimes that don't get prosecuted, or that get investigated in ways guaranteed to produce no result, are the crimes of people who are connected. Fat Tony's operation has survived decades of police presence with a level of stability that requires either extraordinary incompetence or deliberate non-enforcement. Wiggum is depicted as genuinely incompetent in many respects, but his specific failure to act against Fat Tony has a quality that goes beyond incompetence. It has the quality of direction following. Wiggum takes direction from somewhere about what to pursue and what to leave alone. The direction he takes regarding Fat Tony is always the same direction. Who gives the direction? The show implies Mayor Quimby, but there are episodes in which Quimby himself appears to take direction from Fat Tony rather than giving it to him. And there are a handful of episodes in which both Quimby and Fat Tony appear to respond to pressures that originate somewhere outside the city's formal power structure entirely. This is where the CIA suggestion becomes relevant, and it is a suggestion, not a conclusion, but it is specific enough to be worth examining. There are several episodes in which Fat Tony's operation has unexplained connections to institutions that are not criminal in any obvious sense. Federal agencies, intelligence services, defense contractors. These things brush against the edges of Fat Tony's operation in ways that are played as jokes and that the show never develops into coherent explanations. But the touches are specific. They are not the kind of vague gestures that a writer makes when they want to imply shadowy federal involvement without having to specify it. They are the kind of specific, contextual details that suggest the writers had something particular in mind that they chose not to fully develop. The real-world precedent for organized crime serving as a contractor for intelligence services is documented history. Multiple documented cases in American intelligence history involve agencies using organized crime connections for operations that require deniability. Assassination planning, drug trafficking, money laundering, the provision of specific services that government agencies could not officially provide for themselves. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented in congressional hearings and declassified records. Springfield's writers are sophisticated enough to know this history. The specific way they have positioned Fat Tony in a mid-sized American city with connections to federal agencies, a nuclear facility, and a waste management operation that requires deniable disposal echoes this history in ways that feel intentional rather than incidental. What if Fat Tony's Springfield operation is not primarily a local criminal enterprise? What if its primary function is as a cutout, a deniable mechanism through which certain activities can be conducted in Springfield without those activities being formally attributed to the institutions that direct them? This would explain his remarkable operational stability in a place that should not sustain his kind of operation. It would explain his relationship with city government, which is more complex and more mutual than typical mob-politician dynamics. It would explain the nuclear plant connection, which surfaces repeatedly. It would explain his access to resources and information that go beyond what a local crime boss would typically command. And then there is the matter of Fat Tony's replacement. Fat Tony dies in one episode. He is replaced by his cousin, who is essentially identical to him, also called Fat Tony, who assumes all the original's relationships, obligations, and social positions without any apparent disruption to the power structure the original was part of. This is played as a joke. It is also a genuinely strange observation about how institutional power works. The specific individual at the center of Springfield's shadow government is replaceable. His death does not disrupt the structure because the structure does not depend on him. He is a node in a network, not the network's center. A new person assumes the role, and the role continues. This is how institutional power works. It is not how individual criminal enterprises work. Criminal enterprises built around specific individuals tend to fragment when those individuals are removed. The seamless continuity of Springfield's shadow government through Fat Tony's death suggests that it is not, in the relevant sense, Fat Tony's enterprise at all. He is filling a role. The role predates him and will outlast him. Springfield's shadow government was running before the current Fat Tony existed and will continue running after the current Fat Tony is gone. The specific human being was always secondary to the function he fulfilled. What is the function? The show has never specified, but it keeps the lights on, in every sense of that phrase, in a town that needs to keep its lights on more than most. End of Section 4. Section 5. The real fate of Sideshow Bob, why he should be dead by his own logic. There is a man who has tried to kill a 10-year-old child more times than any real-world equivalent would have survived the attempt, more times than any legal system operating under anything resembling actual law would have permitted him to continue attempting, and more times than any coherent personal psychology could sustain as a primary life goal without fragmenting into something unrecognizable. His name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. The show calls him Sideshow Bob. He has been trying to kill Bart Simpson since the 3rd season of The Simpsons, and he has not succeeded. And the reasons why he has not succeeded are, when you examine them carefully, some of the strangest and most revealing things in the entire run of the series. Start with what Sideshow Bob is, before you get to what he does. Bob is, most simply, the show's primary recurring villain, the antagonist who returns most consistently, the character whose relationship with the Simpson family, specifically with Bart, is the closest thing the show has to a genuine, ongoing dramatic relationship that evolves across seasons. He is also, unlike almost any other villain in animated television history, a character of genuine intellectual and cultural sophistication. Operatically educated, classically trained, deeply cultured, possessed of a wit and an intelligence that the show renders with real vividness. He is the character who quotes Gilbert and Sullivan while plotting murder. He is the character whose plans are baroque, not because he lacks intelligence, but because his intelligence has been entirely redirected into the specific project of his obsession. He is, in the best Sideshow Bob episodes, simultaneously funny and genuinely disturbing, in a way that few other Simpsons characters manage. A man of evident gifts, who has spent those gifts on something monstrous, not because he is purely monstrous, but because the path from where he started to where he ended up was available, and he took it, and now he cannot find his way back. This is the first mystery of Sideshow Bob. Why did he take the path? The show offers several partial explanations over the years. Wounded pride from being bested by a child, a pathologically competitive relationship with his brother Cecil, a fundamental incapacity for the adult emotional regulation that his cultural pretensions suggest he should be capable of. But none of these fully accounts for the specific nature of Bob's fixation, its intensity, its durability, its apparent imperviousness to the ordinary human processes of moving on. Bob has had opportunities to leave. He has, at various points in the series, constructed lives for himself outside of his murderous fixation. He has lived in other countries. He has formed genuine romantic relationships. He has achieved at least the surface structure of a functional adult existence, and each time, he has returned to the fixation. Each time, the obsession has reasserted itself and overridden everything else. Each time, Bart has survived, and Bob has returned to prison or exile or some combination, and the cycle has started again. What Bob has, in clinical terms that the show never uses but that the evidence clearly supports, is a fixated delusional relationship with a specific person, one that has become so central to his identity that its removal would constitute the effective dissolution of the self. He is not primarily trying to kill Bart Simpson. He is primarily being Bart Simpson's would-be killer, which is a different thing, and which is why, on some level that the show has always intuited without quite naming, he cannot succeed. His success would destroy the role that constitutes his identity. His continued failure preserves it. This is disturbing if you let it land, because it means that Bob's threat to Bart is perpetual not because of his competence but because of the function the threat serves. Bob needs Bart alive so that Bob can continue to be the person who is trying to kill Bart. And Bart, reciprocally, needs Bob. The character of Bart is sharpened and defined by the existence of a genuine, sophisticated, recurring threat in a way that few other aspects of his life provide. They are, in the most genuinely uncomfortable reading, necessary to each other. Now let's set aside the psychological dimension and examine the practical one, because the practical question of Sideshow Bob's continued freedom is, when you examine the actual record, deeply baffling. Bob's documented criminal history is extensive. He has been convicted of multiple felonies. He has escaped from custody on multiple occasions. He has attempted murder documented, witnessed, in at least some cases caught literally in the act on multiple occasions. He has been involved in plots that go well beyond the attempted murder of one child, election fraud, terrorist threats, crimes against multiple Springfield residents across multiple counties and possibly multiple countries. And he keeps getting out. The show actually, across multiple episodes, attempts to explain how Bob keeps getting out of prison, and the explanations it offers are more troubling than no explanation at all would have been. Bob is depicted as using his intelligence and cultural refinement to manipulate the parole system. He presents well. He speaks eloquently. He appears to have reformed. This is a pointed observation about something real. Parole systems are designed to evaluate rehabilitation, and the metrics they use to measure rehabilitation are necessarily behavioral and presentation-based. Does the person express remorse? Can they articulate insight into their behavior? Do they demonstrate the kind of verbal and emotional intelligence that correlates with the ability to function in society? Bob possesses all of these things in abundance. He is genuinely more intelligent than most parole board members. He is genuinely more articulate. He is genuinely capable of performing rehabilitation with a conviction and sophistication that a real parole board would find compelling. He is also not reformed in any meaningful sense. The fixation is intact. The obsession is intact. Everything that drives him toward Bart is exactly as it was before the most recent incarceration, waiting under the surface of his perfectly executed parole hearing performance, ready to reassert the moment he is back in the world. The parole system fails in Bob's case not because it is corrupt, but because it is measuring the wrong things. It measures the appearance of change. It cannot measure the underlying state, the identity-level fixation, that has organized Bob's entire psychology, because that state is accessible only to someone who knows Bob's actual history with a depth and specificity that a parole board, seeing him for the first time, cannot possess. Bart knows. Bart has always known. And Bart is a child whose testimony about a sophisticated, charming adult is systematically discounted by the institutional structures that are supposed to protect him. Now let's talk about the deaths. Sideshow Bob has been placed in situations that should have been fatal. He has survived things that, applied to any real human body, would produce serious injury or death. The show acknowledges this as a running gag. Bob cannot die, the joke implies, because the show needs him. But within the world of the show, it requires some accounting. In later seasons, the show goes further than the ordinary comedy of Bob's durability. There are episodes in which Bob explicitly does kill Bart, versions of events in which Bart's death is shown, only to be reversed through narrative mechanisms, time travel, alternate realities, reset devices. These episodes are fascinating because they reveal something genuine. The show does not know how to proceed if Bob kills Bart. The resets and reversals are evidence of a real narrative impasse. If Bob succeeds, the show changes in ways that cannot be sustained. Bob cannot succeed. This is not a mystery within the show's world. It is a structural feature of the show's existence. But within the show's world, it looks like something else, like the universe itself protecting Bart, like something in the fabric of Springfield's reality resisting the conclusion of this particular story. Springfield operates according to a logic that protects certain things from the conclusions their own internal dynamics would require. Bob cannot kill Bart for the same reason Homer cannot be permanently fired, for the same reason the ward keeps returning its patients. The show needs things to stay as they are, and Springfield has internalized this need as a feature of its own reality. But Bob knows this. This is what makes him genuinely different from Springfield's other recurring problems. Bob is intelligent enough to understand on some level that he is operating in a system designed to prevent his success. He cannot articulate this understanding within the show. He cannot step outside the frame and name what he's struggling against. But his repeated failures have the quality of a man straining against something he can feel but cannot see, something that bends around him, deflects him, absorbs his best efforts and returns him to the starting position. This is Bob's real tragedy, beneath all the comedy. He is not failing because he is incompetent. He is failing because the story that contains him requires his failure, and he is smart enough to sense this without being able to escape it. A person who is intelligent, driven, psychologically sophisticated, and who consistently fails at their primary goal despite the application of genuine effort, what does this do to them over time? In real life, this kind of chronic failure against an obstacle that cannot be identified or overcome produces either eventual acceptance or a progressive distortion of reasoning that finds increasingly elaborate explanations for why success keeps being prevented. Bob has followed the second path. His plans have become more operatically complex, more removed from the straightforward murder that would technically achieve his goal. He has adopted theatrical staging for his murder attempts that serves no practical purpose, that is, in fact, counterproductive in terms of actually killing Bart, but that serves the deeper psychological purpose of making his failure more comprehensible. If the trap is sufficiently elaborate and perfect, and Bart still escapes, then the escape is miraculous rather than indicative of something fundamental. He wants to be defeated by something worthy of him. He wants the failure to make aesthetic sense. He has been defeated by a 10-year-old, repeatedly, over decades, and the only way his mind can process this without disintegrating is to build elaborate enough structures around the defeat that it becomes something a man of his gifts could not be expected to anticipate. The real Sideshow Bob is a man who has been broken by a paradox he cannot name. He is trying to end a story that cannot end, killing a character who cannot die, in a world that has decided in advance how his efforts will resolve. He should be dead, by his own logic. He should have given up, or succeeded, or been destroyed by the accumulating weight of failure. He has done none of these things. He persists, episode after episode, returning to the same fixation with the same theatrical intensity, performing the same cycle of plot and attempt and failure and reset. He is, in this sense, the most Springfield character in Springfield. He is trapped in a loop he cannot escape, pursuing an outcome the fundamental structure of his world will not permit. Sophisticated enough to sense the trap but not to name it. That is Sideshow Bob. That is the mystery. Not why he keeps failing, but why he keeps trying. Season after season, year after year, the same obsession and the same child and the same ending, played out in ever more elaborate variations of the same eternal loop. End of Section 5. Section 6. Groundskeeper Willie's secret identity and the Scottish conspiracy. There are characters in The Simpsons who are jokes and nothing more, who exist to deliver a specific flavor of humor, to fill a specific function, and who have no more inner life than the setup of the punchline they were created to deliver. These are valid characters. Not every recurring face needs to be a person, in the full sense of the word. And then there is Groundskeeper Willie. Willie is, on the surface, exactly the kind of joke character described above. A one-note parody of Scottish stereotypes, eternally beset by indignities, perpetually ready to remove his shirt and reveal a physique that is itself a running joke, existing primarily to react to the absurdities of Springfield Elementary with a combination of fury and resignation. He is the school's janitor, its groundskeeper, its all-purpose outdoor maintenance figure. He is the man who removes his shirt more often than any character in the history of television. But Willie has, over the course of the show's run, accumulated something that the other joke characters haven't. a backstory, or rather, the fragments of a backstory, distributed across multiple episodes and never assembled into a coherent whole, each piece apparently designed to set up a specific gag, but together forming the outline of a character history that is considerably more disturbing than anything the show has explicitly acknowledged. The specific fragments contradict each other. This is important. Not in the normal Simpsons continuity doesn't matter way, where details shift because the writers needed a specific joke and didn't check what earlier episodes had established. The contradictions in Willie's backstory are too specific, too consistent in their themes, to be purely accidental. They cluster around certain subjects: Scotland, his past life, the circumstances that brought him to Springfield, in ways that suggest that whatever Willie's actual history is, it is something the show has been consistently not quite saying. Let's start with Scotland. Willie is Scottish. This is certain. His accent is consistent. His cultural references are Scottish. His relationship to Scottish identity is a major component of his characterization throughout the series. He came to Springfield from Scotland. But why he came, and what specifically he left behind, is where things get complicated. In different episodes, entirely different backstories are implied or stated. Some versions of Willie's history involve a level of trauma, dispossession, and personal catastrophe that is, for a comedy show's backstory, surprisingly severe. Other versions are lighter, more comic, more consistent with the character being simply a joke rather than a person with actual depth. These versions cannot all be correct. They can't be reconciled in most cases, but they share something. Across all of the show's different accounts of how Willie came to be, Willie, the character of his situation, is consistent. It is not the history of someone who moved for economic opportunity or personal adventure. It is the history of someone who lost something, who left under duress, who carries in his explosive physicality and his volcanic reactions to minor provocations, the specific quality of unprocessed grief and unaddressed loss. Willie does not rage because he is a hothead. Willie rages because raging is the only safe expression for things he cannot grieve properly. And the things he cannot grieve properly are in Scotland, or are the absence of Scotland, or are whatever specific catastrophe removed him from Scotland and deposited him in a school basement in a town he did not choose. Here is the reading that accommodates the contradictions. Willie does not have one backstory. He has multiple backstories that he may himself have generated, consciously or not, as a response to a past he cannot coherently account for. The trauma is real, the rage, the physical excess, the explosive response to even minor provocations all point toward genuine psychological damage. But the specific narrative of that trauma shifts because Willie is not reliably able to access or report his own history accurately. This is a recognizable pattern in clinical psychology. Individuals who have experienced severe trauma often have disrupted autobiographical memory, specifically about the traumatic events, and the narrative they construct around those events is inconsistent, variable, and subject to revision. Willie's contradictory backstories are not continuity errors. They are symptoms. This becomes more interesting when you examine Willie's relationship to Springfield Elementary specifically. Willie has been the groundskeeper at Springfield Elementary for the entire run of the show. He is institutionally permanent, as fixed a feature of the school as Principal Skinner or the building itself. But his relationship to the school, his specific role, what he actually does there, what he knows about the place, is strange in ways that the show never directly addresses. Willie knows things about Springfield Elementary that he should not know. This is not always explicit, but it shows up in background details and throwaway lines with enough consistency to be notable. He has access to areas of the school that the show never explains. He has knowledge of the school's history, its underground spaces, its boiler room and basement, and the various subterranean areas that appear in Halloween episodes and occasionally in regular continuity, that implies a relationship to the building that goes well beyond his official function. The boiler room is Willie's domain in a way that deserves examination. His relationship to it is not just that of an employee with access to a utility space. He inhabits it, he lives in it, or near it, in a way the show acknowledges but never explains. The boiler room is where Willie goes when he has nowhere else to go, which is itself telling, because Willie, despite years of employment, does not appear to have a stable, independent residence. He is, in some sense that the show never fully articulates, part of the school's infrastructure rather than an employee of it. Schools do not have residential groundskeepers. The fact that Willie's existence is organized so completely around this specific institution implies that the institution is not just his workplace but something more fundamental. His psychological anchor, the only stable thing in a life that has been profoundly destabilized. What does Willie know about Springfield Elementary that makes the school the thing he organizes his existence around? What has he seen in his time there that he cannot leave behind? The show has never answered these questions directly, but the groundskeeper who cannot leave, who has made the school's underground his home, who knows the school's hidden spaces better than anyone, has the quality of a man who is staying not because he wants to, but because he knows something that binds him there. He knows where things are buried. This is, in part, a metaphor. In part, it may not be. The boiler room knows. Willie knows. And Willie stays, year after year, his shirt removed and his rage performing and his backstory shifting, the most permanent presence in a school full of children who will leave when they grow up, watching them go and staying behind, as he has always stayed behind, as he will always stay behind. End of Section 6. Section 7. The Springfield Church Cover-Up: What Reverend Lovejoy is Really Hiding. The First Church of Springfield sits where churches sit in American towns that predate the automobile. On a respectable corner, at the appropriate remove from the commerce and politics of the community it serves, its spire visible from certain angles as a reassurance of permanence. It is not the tallest structure in Springfield, not the most economically important, not the most frequently visited, but it has been there longer than most things in the show have been there, and Reverend Timothy Lovejoy has been there longer than most things in the church. Lovejoy is the show's most complex portrait of spiritual burnout. He has been the church's minister for the entire run of the show, which is itself strange. American Protestant ministers serve at the pleasure of their congregations, and 30-plus years in a single parish without disruption is unusual even for the most beloved clergyman. Lovejoy is not beloved. He is present. He is perpetually present in the way that people are present when they cannot leave, when they have obligations that keep them in place, even when every other impulse points toward departure. The show's explanation for Lovejoy's burnout focuses primarily on Ned Flanders. Ned, with his relentless piety and his eagerness to bring every minor concern to his pastor, has over time worn Lovejoy's professional enthusiasm into something close to contempt. Lovejoy changes his phone number regularly to avoid Ned's calls. He delivers sermons with the urgency of someone reading a grocery list. He tends to his model trains, his one visible passion, with more investment than he tends to his flock. This is funny. It is also, when you examine it with any seriousness, a portrait of a man who has been in one place too long and knows too much about it. Why does Lovejoy stay? A minister who has lost his faith, or who has allowed his passion for ministry to be ground down beyond recovery, has options. He can leave, he can transfer, he can take sabbatical, seek counseling, recalibrate his relationship to his vocation. The institutional structures of Protestant Christianity provide these pathways. Lovejoy appears to have never used them. This is curious. It is curious because Lovejoy is not depicted as someone who lacks the self-awareness to recognize that he is burned out. He clearly knows it. He clearly experiences it. He is not a man who has confused his exhaustion with contentment. He is a man who is exhausted and continues anyway, every week, Sunday after Sunday, performing a function whose meaning he has separated from its execution. One possibility? Lovejoy stays because leaving would require accounting for why he left, and the accounting would make visible things that his continued presence, covered by depressed professionalism, keeps invisible. What does Lovejoy know about the First Church of Springfield that makes his departure impossible? The church is old. It has been in Springfield since Springfield was founded, which means it was present for everything that happened in Springfield before the show's official timeline, and everything that happened in the show's official timeline, and everything that happens in the background of the show's official timeline that the show declines to address directly. Every American community institution of sufficient age carries institutional memory that is not identical to its official record. Churches especially. They have been the repositories of community confession, community grief, community shame, and community secret for as long as communities have had churches. The minister is the keeper of this repository. He knows things in his professional capacity that he cannot share. He carries knowledge that belongs to the institution rather than to himself. Lovejoy knows Springfield's secrets in the way that long-serving clergy know the secrets of the communities they serve. Not all at once, not as a grand revelation, but accumulated over decades of presence at every significant moment of Springfield's civic and personal life. He has been at the funerals, the weddings, the moments of crisis. He has heard the confessions, the private admissions, the things people say to their minister that they would not say to anyone else. He knows what Springfield has done. He knows what Springfield has suppressed. He knows about the things that should have been addressed and weren't, the wrongs that were committed and covered, the truths that were outlawed rather than faced. He knows because people tell their ministers, and he has been in Springfield for a very long time. The model trains make sense in this context. They are the one space he controls completely, where nothing unexpected happens, where the track determines the path and the outcome is known in advance. They are the specific pleasure of a man whose professional life involves being the repository of everything unresolved in a community that is constitutionally resistant to resolution. He cannot leave. He knows too much. And the things he knows are tied to this place in ways that cannot be carried out of it, that would not survive the departure, that require his continued presence in the building that has been collecting Springfield's secrets for its entire existence. So he stays. He tends his trains. He reads his scripture with the inflection of a man who stopped believing his own words some time ago. And Springfield goes to church on Sunday, and hears what it needs to hear, and goes home. The spire is visible from certain angles. It has been visible for longer than anyone in Springfield remembers. End of Section 7. Section 8. Patty and Selma's secret about Homer, a conspiracy since Season 1. There is a specific kind of family antagonism that is so consistent, so reliable, so impervious to the individual circumstances that might otherwise modify it, that it stops looking like a personal feeling and starts looking like a project. It is the antagonism that has a purpose. It is the kind of sustained hostility that maintains itself across decades and across changing contexts, and that requires, when you examine it carefully, an investment of energy and attention that goes well beyond what ordinary dislike would generate. Patty and Selma Bouvier have hated Homer Simpson since before they appear on screen. This is not precisely a mystery. The show acknowledges it freely and builds comedy around it throughout its run. The Bouvier sisters' disdain for their brother-in-law is one of the show's most consistent running gags, a reliable source of specific comedic energy in the episodes where it features. It is played as the garden variety in-law conflict that many families contain. The siblings who didn't approve of the match, who have never moderated their disapproval, who find in the brother-in-law a repository for everything that irritates them. This reading is available. It may even be partially correct. But here's what's strange about Patty and Selma's specific hostility toward Homer. Its history. The history of the Simpson-Bouvier relationship, specifically how and when Marge and Homer got together, and what Patty and Selma knew about it, and when they knew, it has been depicted in the show's several flashback episodes, with an inconsistency that is more than just continuity, indifference. The inconsistencies cluster around specific questions. When exactly did the sisters develop their hatred of Homer? What did they see, or learn, or understand about Homer that produced a feeling this durable and this intense? What specific event or revelation produced a hostility so structural, so impervious to modification, so maintained across decades that it feels less like emotion and more like commitment? The show has offered multiple accounts of this. In different episodes, the antipathy is established at different points in the Homer-Marge relationship's history under different circumstances, apparently triggered by different events or revelations. These multiple accounts cannot all be correct, but they share something. Whatever the specific trigger, across all of the show's different accounts of how the sisters came to feel what they feel, the character of the feeling is consistent. It is not the dislike of people who find Homer annoying or socially embarrassing. It is the dislike of people who believe, with the conviction of actual knowledge, that Homer is genuinely bad for Marge, that the marriage is harmful, that Marge has made a mistake she is paying for in ways the sisters can see but Marge apparently cannot. This is the content of their feeling. Not that Homer is a bore, but that Homer is a harm. And here's the thing. Across 30-plus seasons, there is an enormous amount of evidence that they might be right. Homer has, in the course of the show, done things to Marge that, in a realistic assessment of a real marriage, would constitute serious, ongoing problems. He has prioritized his own impulses over the family's welfare with a consistency that functions less as a character flaw than as a fundamental orientation. He has been thoughtless, selfish, and occasionally cruel in ways the show often frames as forgivable because they are followed by redemptive gestures. The show loves Homer. The audience loves Homer. The narrative structure of The Simpsons is organized around forgiving Homer because Homer, despite everything, is lovable in specific ways that his specific failures somehow do not cancel out. Patty and Selma do not share this structure. They see Homer from outside the show's forgiving frame. They have always seen him from outside that frame, and their consistent, decades-long conviction that he is bad for Marge is not just an in-law trope. It is, in a show that is otherwise committed to forgiving its protagonist, a persistent counter-argument, a dissent that has been running alongside the show's official verdict for its entire run. But this is not the secret. This is the surface. The actual question is why Patty and Selma are so specifically invested in maintaining this position across decades at the expense of their own relationship with Marge, who has repeatedly asked them to moderate their hostility toward her husband. Marge loves Homer. She has made her choice. She will continue to make her choice. The sisters' continued expression of disapproval does not change this. It just creates friction between them and their sister. If their concern were purely for Marge's welfare, the rational response at some point would be to moderate the expression of that concern and preserve the relationship, even while privately maintaining their assessment of Homer. You can love someone and disagree with their choices and still choose to prioritize the relationship over the disagreement. They don't do this. They have never done this. Their hostility remains at the same temperature across the entire run of the show, as if it is being maintained rather than felt, as if its continued expression serves a purpose beyond the communication of a feeling. What purpose? The answer the show quietly builds toward, across multiple episodes that never connect their own dots, is that Patty and Selma know something specific about Homer, something from the early history of the relationship, something they learned or witnessed before the show's official narrative begins that Marge does not know or has never fully processed. And their continued hostility is, at least in part, the ongoing expression of that knowledge, the refusal to let the secret become entirely invisible. The insistence on marking Homer with their disapproval even when that disapproval produces no practical result, because the disapproval is the only form in which their knowledge can be expressed in the social space of the family. What do they know? The show has offered hints without providing answers. There are episodes where the sisters' knowledge of Homer's past is revealed to be more specific and more damaging than the show's normal comedic treatment of their dislike would suggest. There are episodes where their behavior toward Homer shifts temporarily, and the circumstances that produce that shift are revealing. They are always circumstances in which the sisters have achieved some leverage, extracted some concession, obtained something that temporarily satisfies a claim that is never named. Patty and Selma treat Homer like someone who owes them something. Not money, not a specific tangible thing, but something more fundamental. An acknowledgement. A reckoning that has never come and that they have given up expecting but still, in some deep and automatic part of themselves, wait for. This reckoning is connected to Marge, to something in Marge's history or Marge's perception of her marriage or Marge's understanding of who she chose and why. The sisters know something about this that Marge either doesn't know or has suppressed in the specific way that Springfield suppresses all its difficult truths completely, without acknowledgement, without grief. The conspiracy, such as it is not a malicious one. It is the conspiracy of people who are protecting someone from something while being unable to tell them directly what they're being protected from. It is the conspiracy of love expressed as hostility, of caring that has curdled into something that looks like its opposite but isn't. Patty and Selma are not Homer's enemies. Precisely. They are Marge's guardians, poorly, inconsistently, in ways that produce as much harm as they prevent, in a role that no one asked them to play and that they have never been able to relinquish. And at the center of all of it, beneath the surface comedy of their chain-smoking disapproval, beneath the broad gag of the hostile sisters-in-law, is something they saw, or heard, or understood a long time ago, that they have been carrying ever since. Marge doesn't ask. Homer doesn't want to know. The sisters keep carrying it, year after year, their cigarettes burning down and their disapproval remaining at its constant temperature, guarding a secret that may, at this point, have outlasted any practical relevance it might once have had. But they keep it, because some things, once known, cannot be set down. End of Section 8. Section 9. The Itchy and Scratchy Dimension. What the show within a show actually reveals. There is, nested within The Simpsons, another show. It is called Itchy and Scratchy, and it has been running alongside the main series since the earliest episodes, presented as the favorite cartoon of the Simpson children and the cultural backdrop against which the family's daily life plays out. It is a show within a show, a cartoon within a cartoon, and it has accumulated, over 3 decades of broadcast time, Enough detail and enough internal history to constitute something more than a recurring gag. It has become a document of what Springfield is and what Springfield does to the people who live inside it, rendered in a form so stripped down and so stylized that its meaning is hiding in plain sight. Itchy and Scratchy is, on its surface, a parody of violent cartoons, specifically of Tom and Jerry, whose cat-and-mouse dynamic it takes and amplifies to a gleeful and graphic extreme. The mouse kills the cat, always, elaborately, with a creativity of violence that increases with each subsequent appearance. The cat suffers in ways that the show renders with a level of graphic detail that would be disturbing if you weren't immediately laughing at it. And that immediate laughter is the key. The show has weaponized the specific quality of cartoon violence that makes suffering funny by being stylized, by being safely contained within the frame of animation, by being disconnected from any consequence or context that would make it feel real. This is the surface. The show uses Itchy and Scratchy throughout its run to make explicit points about media, about violence, about what audiences find entertaining and why, about the corrupting influence of commercial pressures on creative decisions. These points are often well made. They are the intended meaning of the show within a show, the commentary the writers put there deliberately when they put Itchy and Scratchy into the show at all. But Itchy and Scratchy has been running for 30 years, and in that time it has accumulated something that the commentary was never designed to accumulate, a relationship to Springfield itself that goes deeper than satire. Let's start with what the children actually experience when they watch it. Springfield's children watch Itchy and Scratchy with a devotion and intensity that the show depicts as both funny and, if you're paying attention, faintly alarming. Bart and Lisa are enthusiastic fans. Their engagement with the cartoon is presented as the engagement of normal children with entertainment they find exciting without necessarily processing its content. The standard relationship between children and violent media that has been a subject of public hand-wringing since long before The Simpsons aired. But the specific relationship between Springfield's children and Itchy and Scratchy goes beyond normal. The children don't just watch it. They are invested in it in a way that has the quality of emotional dependency rather than simple entertainment preference. They follow its continuity with an attention that they do not apply to the actual events of their own lives. They are distressed by changes to the formula in ways that suggest the formula is serving a psychological function that goes beyond being entertained. What function? Consider what Itchy and Scratchy provides to its Springfield audience that their actual lives do not provide. In Itchy and Scratchy, the dynamic is always clear. Itchy always wins. Scratchy always loses. The suffering always ends not because Scratchy escapes or learns or finds a way to break the cycle, but because the episode ends. The reset is built into the structure. Scratchy will be fine at the start of the next cartoon, ready to suffer again, with no memory of the previous suffering to complicate the fresh round of torment. This is, in its essential structure, identical to how Springfield itself works. In Springfield, bad things happen and then reset. Catastrophes occur and are forgotten. Suffering is experienced and then erased. The same problems recur with the same people in the same configurations, because the reset is structural, not incidental. Springfield is a world in which consequences don't stick, in which memory is selective in ways that consistently select against the retention of difficult truths, in which the baseline is always reasserted regardless of how dramatically it was disrupted. Springfield's children are watching a cartoon that mirrors the fundamental mechanics of the world they live in. Scratchy suffers and resets. Springfield suffers and resets. The cycle continues. Nobody escapes. Nobody learns. The cartridge is never changed. Only the specific form of the suffering varies from episode to episode. What does it do to a child to grow up in a world whose fundamental structure is mirrored by their favorite cartoon? What does it do to the development of a child's understanding of cause and effect, of consequence, of the relationship between action and outcome, to be immersed from the earliest age in both a cartoon and a real world that share the same essential logic? Suffering happens, suffering ends, the same situation reconstitutes, and suffering happens again? The show raises this question in a muffled way through its depiction of the children's engagement with Itchy and Scratchy. It never answers it directly because answering it directly would require the show to examine its own structure in a way that the show's narrative has never been willing to do explicitly. The meta-awareness that would produce that examination is the one form of awareness that Springfield, as a world, is constitutionally prevented from achieving. Now let's go deeper into the structural mirror. Itchy is the character with power. Itchy sets the terms of every encounter. determines when the encounter begins and how it proceeds, chooses the specific form of the suffering he inflicts, and controls the ending. He is inventive, energetic, apparently unlimited in his capacity for creativity in the specific domain of inflicting harm. He is also entirely without conscience, not in the sense of being evil in a way that requires dramatic portrayal, but in the simpler, more disturbing sense of simply not registering Scratchy's suffering as something that produces any internal response in him whatsoever. Scratchy's pain is not a problem to be solved, not a wrong to be addressed, not even a thing to be taken any particular satisfaction in. It is simply what Scratchy is for. This is a specific and recognizable description of how power operates in Springfield. Mr. Burns does not register the suffering of Springfield's residents as something that produces any internal response in him. The people who drink the contaminated water and develop the symptoms of chronic, low-level radiation poisoning are not, to Burns, a problem to be solved or a wrong to be addressed. They are simply what the people of Springfield are for a labor supply, a tax base, a population whose chronic impairment ensures their continuing compliance. Their suffering, like Scratchy's suffering, is not the point of the arrangement. It is simply the predictable byproduct of an arrangement whose actual point is the continuous reproduction of the conditions that allow Burns to maintain his power. Scratchy is Homer, or, more precisely, Scratchy is the position that Homer occupies within Springfield's power structure. The character whose suffering is the engine that keeps the show running, who resets after each instance of that suffering to be ready for the next one, who is never given the capacity to learn from what happens to him in a way that would change the fundamental dynamic. And the children of Springfield sit in front of the television every afternoon and watch this dynamic and laugh, because the cartoon is funny, because the violence is cartoonish, because the suffering is stylized and the reset is built in, and there are no real consequences for anyone. They are being trained to find the dynamic funny. They are being calibrated to receive the specific configuration of power and suffering and reset that organizes their world as entertainment rather than as horror. They are being prepared, by a cartoon, for the specific quality of life that Springfield will provide them. This is probably more than the show's writers consciously put there, but it is what 30 years of building has produced, and it is visible if you're willing to look at the accumulated structure rather than any individual piece of it. There is also the matter of Itchy and Scratchy's in-universe history, which is worth examining with some care because it adds another layer to the already dense structure. The show within a show has a documented founding history. It was created in the mid-20th century under circumstances that involved the theft of creative credit from its original creator, Chester J. Lampwick. Lampwick created the characters, developed the concept, produced the original cartoons. Roger Myers Sr., the founder of the studio that produced and distributed the cartoons, stole that creation, suppressed the creator's identity, and built a profitable media franchise on work that was never paid for and never credited. This backstory is presented as satire of real-world entertainment industry exploitation, and it works on that level. It draws on documented real cases in animation history, where creators were stripped of credit and compensation in ways that enriched the companies that distributed their work. The satire is pointed and not inaccurate, but within the show's world it means something specific and uncomfortable. The cultural product that Springfield's children love most, that is the primary entertainment of the town's youngest residents, that they watch with the intensity of emotional dependency, was founded on theft, on exploitation, on the erasure of a working-class creator in favor of a corporate structure that profited from his work without acknowledging him. The show that Springfield's children love was built by stealing from someone who looked a lot like the people of Springfield. Its entire existence rests on the suppressed history of someone who was cheated and silenced by the same kind of power that cheats and silences Springfield's residents in their daily lives. And Springfield's children consume it every day and love it and never know. This is the itchy and scratchy dimension in its fullest form. The show is not just a mirror of Springfield's dynamics, it is a product of those dynamics, generated by the same configuration of power and exploitation that generates everything else in Springfield, and consumed by the people who are most subject to that configuration without ever being given the tools to understand what they are looking at. The cat suffers, the mouse wins, the audience applauds, and somewhere in the applause, if you listen for it, you can hear Springfield applauding itself, applauding the very thing that is happening to it, because it has been taught from childhood to experience that thing as entertainment, rather than as the system it actually is. End of Section 9. Section 10. The final mystery: what Springfield actually is? and why no one can ever leave. We have been building toward this for 9 sections. We have sat with the psychiatric ward that processes its patients back into the same conditions that produce their breakdown, that cycles and cycles without healing, because the system is calibrated for management rather than cure. We have counted the children who disappeared from the active life of the show, who fell out of Springfield's eternal present into the space between episodes, ungrieved and unremarked. We have mapped the shadow government that runs beneath Springfield's formal institutions, the specific configuration of Fat Tony and Mayor Quimby and Mr. Burns that has maintained itself across decades with the stability of something structural rather than personal, absorbing the deaths of its participants with the smoothness of a machine processing a worn part. We have sat with the man who cannot succeed at his life's project, and the minister who cannot leave his post, and the sisters who carry knowledge they have never been able to set down. We have watched the show within a show that might be the whole show, the cartoon about unending suffering, whose audience is the population that is itself subject to unending suffering, who laugh at the cartoon without being able to recognize what it is they are laughing at. All of these things are real, in the sense that they are present in the accumulated detail of 30-plus years of The Simpsons. They are not inventions. They are the residue of genuine creative work of writers and animators and voice performers and production staff who, over decades, made thousands of individual decisions that were never intended to combine into the pattern they have combined into. They laid down detail on top of detail on top of detail, episode by episode, season by season, without a plan for what the whole thing would look like from the outside once enough time had passed. Now enough time has passed. And what it looks like from the outside is what we have been examining. What I want to do in this final section is assemble the picture, not to produce a theory that explains everything, because there is no single theory that explains everything about a show this long and this complex and this fundamentally self-contradictory, but to name what the accumulated evidence points toward when you look at it as a whole rather than as a collection of individual mysteries. What is Springfield? Springfield is a closed system. This is the formal description of what the show has been depicting, and it is worth understanding what it means with some precision. A closed system, in the technical sense, is one that does not exchange matter or energy with its environment in ways that change its fundamental state. It cycles internally. It conserves its own components. It is characterized by the persistence of its own patterns regardless of what enters it, because what enters it is always processed and metabolized by the existing structure rather than changing that structure. Springfield is not literally a closed system. Things enter and exit it constantly. New characters arrive. Events from the outside world impinge on it. Characters travel, experience other places, bring knowledge and perspective back. The show has always been willing to bring the outside world into Springfield when the outside world serves the show's comic needs. But Springfield is functionally closed, in the sense that nothing entering it ever changes it in any fundamental way. Characters who arrive in Springfield full of energy and difference become Springfield characters within a season or less absorbed into the town's social gravity, fitted into its existing patterns. Their novelty processed and metabolized until what remains is someone who functions within Springfield's framework rather than challenging it. Characters who leave Springfield and return bring back experiences, but not transformation. They have been away, and now they are back. And Springfield closes around them the same way it closed around them before they left, and the patterns continue. This is the experience of many people in many communities, and it is part of why The Simpsons has resonated so deeply with so many audiences for so long. The experience of returning to a place you've left and finding it unchanged, finding yourself unchanged within it, slipping back into old patterns with a naturalness that is both comforting and appalling, is one of the most recognizable experiences in human life. The show captures it with a fidelity that goes beyond any individual episode and accumulates across the whole run into something that feels true in the specific way that things feel true when they are accurate to actual human experience. But in Springfield's case, the closure is not just experiential, it is structural. It is produced by specific mechanisms that the show has been depicting and occasionally examining throughout its run. The water is the most literal mechanism. We have discussed this at length already, but it bears returning to in this context because it is the most concrete version of what Springfield does to the people who live inside it. The water comes from a contaminated source. It has been coming from a contaminated source for the entire duration of the show's existence. The contaminants it carries the specific combination of industrial and nuclear pollutants that the Springfield River accumulates from the plant's runoff, affect neurological function at levels that are too low to produce obvious, dramatic symptoms but too sustained to be without effect. The specific effects are the ones that make Springfield Springfield. Impaired impulse control, difficulty with long-term planning, reduced capacity for complex causal reasoning, attenuated processing of uncomfortable emotional states. These are not the effects of a single high-level exposure. They are the effects of chronic, low-level exposure across an entire lifetime. The effects that accumulate so gradually that there is no moment of clear before and after, no transition that can be pointed to and named as the change, just a slow calibration of the brain's functioning to a slightly different set of baseline parameters. The Springfield residents are cognitively calibrated to Springfield. Their neurology has been adjusted. Over decades of drinking the same water and breathing the same air and living in the shadow of the same cracked cooling towers, into a form that is specifically adapted to Springfield's particular variety of dysfunction. They fit Springfield the way a key fits a lock, not because of who they are, but because of what the place has done to them over time. This is why they cannot leave. Not because they are physically prevented, as we noted, characters do leave Springfield, temporarily, regularly, but because the calibration goes with them. Because the neurology they carry is Springfield's neurology, adjusted to Springfield's specific conditions, and it will express itself as Springfield-type behavior, regardless of where its owner is physically located. You can take the person out of Springfield, but Springfield has already done its work on the person, and the work persists. Marge has left Springfield. She has pursued lives that look different, careers and opportunities and relationships outside the town's gravitational field. She has always come back, and the show always presents her return as a free choice, as love winning out over opportunity, as the family mattering more than personal ambition. And this is almost certainly the intended reading. The show loves Marge. The show needs Marge to choose her family, because the alternative Marge choosing herself is a story The Simpsons was never built to tell. But Marge's choices, across the show's run, have a quality that goes beyond free choice in the simple sense. They have the quality of someone whose range of available futures has been constrained in ways she cannot fully perceive. Someone whose capacity for imagining herself outside the specific role she occupies in Springfield has been attenuated by the same forces that attenuate everyone's capacity for imagining something other than what is. She is not trapped, she is calibrated. And the calibration looks like choice from the inside. The same is true of Homer. The same is true of Bart, who has been in rebellion against Springfield's constraints for 30 years with a persistence that demonstrates genuine spirit and genuine intelligence, but whose rebellion has never produced escape, has never changed the fundamental situation, has only generated the specific kind of chaos that Springfield has always accommodated as one of its running features. Bart's rebellions are part of the pattern. They are not challenges to the pattern. They are, in their own way, the pattern. Now let's talk about the children. Because the children are where the future of the closed system is being determined, episode by episode, season by season, and the future the show depicts is not optimistic. Bart and Lisa are the show's most sustained portrait of what it means to grow up in Springfield, which is to say, to not grow up at all. They are permanently 10 and 8 respectively. They will never be older. They will never accumulate the specific kind of wisdom that comes from actually aging through the things that happen to them, from carrying the consequences of their experiences forward into a future that is different from their past because they themselves are different. They will experience the same dynamics over and over, and then reset, and the reset will erase the growth, and they will start fresh, and the dynamic will recur. This is what happens to every child who grows up in Springfield. Not the cartoon version of it, not the literal inability to age that is a structural feature of the show's premise, but the functional version. The erosion of the capacity for certain kinds of growth by the specific conditions of the environment, the calibration of the developing mind to the baseline functioning that Springfield's conditions produce, the quiet ensuring that the next generation will be as Springfield as the current generation. The psychiatric ward processes the overflow. The water does the baseline work. The institutions, the school, the church, the police, the city government maintain the social conditions that make the calibration coherent and self-reinforcing. And the shadow government, running beneath the formal institutions with Fat Tony at its visible face and Burns behind him, ensures that the specific interests served by all of this continue to be served, that the material conditions that produce the environmental contamination are never meaningfully challenged, that the accountability that would be required to actually change anything never manages to crystallize into a form that can produce action. This is the system. This is Springfield. And it has been running for more than 30 years, and it will keep running because the show keeps running, and the show keeps running because the audience keeps watching, and the audience keeps watching because Springfield is home. This is the last thing I want to say, and it is the thing that the show has been building toward in its own oblique way since its very first episode. Springfield is home. Not just in the narrative sense, not just as the setting of a television show, but in the sense that Springfield, as a place and as an idea, has become genuinely home to the audience that has been watching it for 30-plus years. There are people alive today who have been watching The Simpsons for their entire conscious lives. There are people for whom Springfield is more vivid, more familiar, more emotionally resonant than any place they have actually lived. There are people who know the streets of Springfield, the route from Evergreen Terrace to the Quickie Mart, the layout of Springfield Elementary, the view from the nuclear plant across the Springfield River, with the specific tactile familiarity that we usually reserve for the places where our actual lives happened. This is not a small thing. This is the specific magic of the show, the thing that is irreducible to any analysis of its quality or its content or its cultural significance. The Simpsons created a place, and people moved into it, and they've been living there for 30 years, and it is home. And here is where the mysteries we have been examining become something more than mysteries. Here is where the accumulated disturbing detail of Springfield, the contamination, the disappeared children, the shadow government, the psychiatric ward, the ministers who can't leave and the criminals who won't be stopped and the cats who suffer forever and the families frozen in time becomes something that has a specific relationship to its audience. We have been watching a closed system for 30 years. We have been consuming, as entertainment, the depiction of a community's systematic inability to change, to grow, to escape its own patterns, to hold its powerful accountable or protect its vulnerable or see itself clearly. We have laughed at the impairment. We have found the reset charming. We have loved Homer's failures and found Marge's patience admirable and been delighted by Bart's chaos and rooted for Lisa's idealism with the specific mixture of affection and resignation that comes from watching someone try very hard in a situation that is not designed for them to succeed. We have been doing this for 30 years, and in doing it, we have created a relationship to this fictional dysfunction that is, perhaps, not entirely separate from our relationship to our own dysfunction. The patterns of Springfield, the impaired leadership, the corrupted institutions, the environmental degradation, addressed with jokes rather than action, the powerful insulated from consequences, while the vulnerable cycle through systems designed to manage rather than help them, are not exclusive to Springfield. The show has always known this. It has always been, at some level, a show about America as much as a show about The Simpsons. Springfield is not a precise map of any particular American community, but it is a recognizable portrait of American community as a type, a composite of the specific varieties of dysfunction that American communities produce and maintain and normalize and cannot escape. We love Springfield because we recognize it. We recognize it because we live in it, not in the specific town with the nuclear plant and the shadow government and the psychiatric ward cycling its patients back into the contaminated environment, but in the broader Springfield, in the version of civic life that the show has been depicting for 30 years, with its compromised institutions and its managed crises, and its collective agreement to not quite see the things that would require the most uncomfortable responses. The mysteries of Springfield are the mysteries of ourselves. The closed system that traps Springfield's residents is not separate from the closed systems that trap us. The calibration that makes Springfield's residents fit their dysfunctional environment is not fundamentally different from the calibration that makes us fit ours. This is why nobody in Springfield can leave. Not because Springfield is a prison, not because the exit is blocked, not because some external force prevents departure, but because the place has done its work on them, and the work is them now, and they carry it wherever they go, and it will express itself as Springfield wherever they are, because it is what they are. The water is fine, they keep telling you. The water is fine, and Springfield keeps running, and we keep watching, and the Sunday night couch keeps receiving us, and the theme plays, and Bart writes his detention lines, and Homer comes through the door, and the family assembles on the couch, and the cartoon channel is flipped to, and Itchy and Scratchy are fighting, and somewhere in the background the plant hums, and the water flows from the river, and the ward is open, and Fat Tony is in his restaurant, and Reverend Lovejoy is with his trains. And it is home. It has always been home. It will always be home. Because Springfield doesn't let you go. Springfield doesn't have to hold on. Springfield just has to be what it is. And wait, and you will come back to it. Every week, every season, every year that you are alive and this show is running. You will come back because you always do. You will come back because that is what Springfield is for. And when you sit down on the couch and the theme plays, the thing that you feel, that warmth, that comfort, that specific pleasure of return is real. It is genuinely real. And it is not separate from the other thing, the thing we have been examining in this video. The weight of the place and the pattern and the machinery running beneath the comedy. Both of those things are Springfield. They have always both been Springfield. The warmth and the weight, the joke and the thing underneath the joke. The family you love and the system that has broken that family, generation by generation, with patient and invisible thoroughness. That is what Springfield actually is. And now you know. End of section 10. End of script. Section 11. The truth about Moe's Tavern, what is actually being served at the bar. Moe's Tavern is one of the most recognizable locations in The Simpsons. It has been Homer's primary social destination outside the home for the entire run of the series. The place he retreats to after work, after conflict, after the specific quality of mild domestic catastrophe that organizes his daily life. It is, in many episodes, the place where the show's male social world coalesces. Homer and his friends, Barney and Lenny and Carl, gathered around drinks in a space that is dim and slightly run down and deeply, specifically comfortable in the way that places are comfortable when they are exactly what they claim to be. The bar is called Moe's, the barman is called Moe, the beer is called Duff. These three facts are among the most stable in the entire Simpsons universe. More stable than Homer's relationship with his wife, more stable than the physical geography of the town, more stable than almost anything else about Springfield's shifting, self-contradictory internal world. Moe, his bar, and his beer have been constants for more than 30 years, which is why the anomalies stand out. Moe Sheslack is, when you examine him carefully, one of the strangest characters in the show's ensemble. He is the show's primary portrait of a specific variety of American male loneliness. The loneliness of a man who has been passed over by every good thing, who has watched his contemporaries build lives and loves and connections while he remained behind the bar, serving them, present for every milestone without being a participant in any of them. He is caustic, self-aware in the specific, painful way of people who understand their situation clearly without having any ability to change it, and occasionally capable of surprising emotional depth in episodes that take his interiority seriously. He is also a man with an unexplained past that the show has returned to enough times to suggest it matters without ever fully committing to what it is. Moe's backstory is, like Willie's backstory, characterized by a contradictory accumulation of incompatible histories. He has been a child actor. He has been a professional boxer. Specifically, he was once known as Kid Gorgeous, a detail the show introduces and then periodically revisits in ways that position the boxing as something other than a comedic aside. He has connections to organized crime that the show depicts with more specificity than his other backstory elements, returning to them across multiple episodes in ways that suggest they are structural rather than incidental. The organized crime connection is the thread worth pulling. Moe's relationship to Fat Tony and to Springfield's shadow government is depicted with a specificity that distinguishes it from the broad, comedic portrayal of many of the show's characters. He has had dealings with Fat Tony. The dealings are presented as part of his history rather than as a current relationship, as something that happened, that shaped his trajectory, that explains certain features of his current situation without being fully named as an explanation. The connection is there. The show acknowledges it. And then the show moves on to the next joke without following where the acknowledgement points. Where does it point? Consider Moe's Tavern as a business. It is, by any realistic assessment, a business that should not be able to sustain itself. It serves a small, regular customer base in a location that does not appear to attract significant foot traffic. Its physical condition suggests either minimal maintenance investment or deliberate cultivation of a certain kind of shabby authenticity that serves a specific clientele. Its pricing appears to be the pricing of a bar that is not primarily trying to make money from the prices it charges for drinks. The show has occasionally acknowledged that Moe's is not a financially successful business in any obvious sense. There are episodes where Moe's financial difficulties are the central plot episodes, where the bar is on the brink of closure, Where Mo is trying various schemes to attract new customers or generate new revenue streams, where his economic precariousness is played for comedy and occasionally for genuine sympathy. And yet the bar never closes. Despite the financial difficulties, despite the small customer base, despite the apparent lack of anything that would make it economically viable, Moe's remains open. It absorbs its crises and continues. What keeps Moe's Tavern open? The most straightforward answer is that the show's premise requires it that Homer needs a bar and Moe needs to be running one, and the narrative requires both of these facts to be true indefinitely. This is correct in the meta-narrative sense, but it is also, in the same way we have been examining all of Springfield's structural features, a fact that the show's world has internalized in ways that produce specific in-world explanations that are more interesting than the meta-narrative one. Moe's Tavern may function, at least in part, as something other than a legitimate bar. The specific features of its operation, its small, reliable customer base that does not require advertising or expansion, its physical separation from the main flow of Springfield's commercial life, its owner's documented connections to organized crime, its improbable financial survival across decades, are consistent with a business that serves as a front for other activities or that benefits from revenue streams that are not visible in its legitimate operations. Front businesses, in the organized crime context, do not need to be profitable on their surface operations. They need to appear to be legitimate businesses to have a plausible reason for their existence, a visible function that explains their presence, while their actual financial sustainability comes from the less visible activities they enable. They need to be exactly what Moe's is, a place that has a clear surface identity, that serves a genuine function for the people who use it, that is not suspicious precisely because it is so completely what it claims to be. This reading connects to the broader picture of Springfield's shadow government that we examined in Section 4. Fat Tony's operation requires infrastructure, physical locations, trusted relationships, spaces where certain kinds of activity can occur without attracting the specific kind of attention that would be inconvenient. Moe's Tavern, in this reading, is one of those spaces. It is the place in Springfield's legitimate social landscape where certain conversations can happen, certain arrangements can be made, certain things can pass between parties who need a venue that is simultaneously public enough to be unremarkable and private enough to be safe. Homer drinks there every day. Homer, with his demonstrated inability to understand the significance of what he witnesses, is the perfect witness to whatever activity makes Moe's Tavern more than what it appears to be. He is there, reliably, day after day, and he sees what he sees and understands nothing. And Moe watches him, from behind the bar, with the expression of a man who knows considerably more than he lets on and who has learned, over decades, that knowing more than you let on is the specific skill set that keeps you alive in Springfield. Moe is one of the show's most under-examined characters, in the sense that the darkness the show has placed in him, the organized crime connections, the unexplained past, the financial resilience that doesn't make sense as an honest bar, has never been assembled into a direct account of who he actually is and what his bar actually is. But the accumulation is there. The details are there. And when you look at them together, the bar that Homer considers his second home starts to look considerably stranger than the warm, dim, slightly sad neighborhood establishment that it presents itself as. Moe knows. Moe has always known. The beer is cold and the lights are low and the cash register is always running, one way or another. And Moe wipes the bar with his rag and says nothing and keeps the secret of what he is keeping, the way he has always kept it, the way Springfield has always kept it. The drinks are real, the friends are real, the comfort is real. Homer drinks his beer and does not think about any of this. He never has. End of Section 11. Section 12. The Quickie Mart and the Apu Paradox, the most observed man in Springfield. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon has been behind the counter of the Quickie Mart for the entire run of The Simpsons. He is one of the show's most enduring supporting characters, and also one of the most contested. His portrayal has been the subject of genuine and important cultural criticism that the show itself has addressed, imperfectly and incompletely, in ways that revealed more about the show's relationship to its own assumptions than any more direct engagement would have. But set aside, for the moment, the debate about how Apu is portrayed. Set it aside not because it is unimportant, it is important, and it is real, but because there is a separate question about Apu that receives almost no attention in the extensive cultural conversation about his character, and that separate question is, in its own way, just as interesting as the representation question. The question is, what is Apu actually doing in Springfield? Apu holds a doctorate in computer science. This is established fact within the show. He has a PhD from Caltech. He has demonstrated on multiple occasions an intellectual capability that goes well beyond what the role of a convenience store operator requires, and the gap between his educational background and his actual employment has been addressed in the show as a source of comedy that is occasionally allowed to become something more poignant. The standard reading of this gap is that it reflects a real-world reality. The experience of highly educated immigrants who find that their credentials do not translate into employment equivalent to their qualifications, who end up in jobs that do not reflect their capabilities for reasons that have to do with systemic barriers rather than individual failings. The show uses Apu's situation to gesture toward this reality, with varying degrees of seriousness. But there is another reading, one that is suggested by several specific features of Apu's presence in Springfield that the standard reading does not quite account for. Apu knows everything that happens in Springfield. This is not hyperbole. The Quickie Mart is positioned, within Springfield's social geography, as the town's primary point of passage for a significant portion of its population. It is where Springfield's residents go for the small purchases that organize daily life, the convenience purchases, the impulse buys, the late-night needs. It is open at all hours. It is accessible from every part of the town. And Apu, who seems to work essentially all of the hours that the store is open, has observed, across decades of operation, an extraordinary proportion of Springfield's residents in the specific context of their daily habits. Daily habits are revealing. The things people buy at a convenience store at what hours, in what combinations, in what states of apparent stress or ease tell you an enormous amount about those people's actual lives. The purchases that don't fit the official narrative, the late-night visits that suggest something about what is happening at home, the specific patterns that, over months and years of regular observation, resolve into a portrait of each customer's actual existence rather than the existence they present to the world. Apu has been observing these patterns for the entire run of the show. He has, by this point, accumulated a body of observational knowledge about Springfield's residents that is almost certainly the most comprehensive informal intelligence file on any American community in the history of fictional television. What does he do with this knowledge? The show has never directly addressed this question, but it has, in several specific episodes, depicted Apu as possessing knowledge about Springfield's residents that he could only have through observation knowledge that goes beyond what a shopkeeper would normally have about his customers, that has the quality of having been accumulated deliberately rather than incidentally. Apu is also, the show has established, in contact with the Quickie Mart Corporation in ways that go beyond a normal franchisee relationship. The corporation is depicted as a powerful, opaque organization with its own mysterious internal culture and its own complex relationship to its franchisees that the show has never fully explained. The CEO of the corporation, Sanjay Patel, is introduced in one episode as a figure of considerable and unexplained power, accessible only through extraordinary means, possessed of an authority that extends well beyond what a convenience store chain's CEO would normally exercise. What does the Quickie Mart Corporation want with Springfield? What does Apu's presence at the Quickie Mart, this specific store, in this specific town, operated by this specific man, with his specific combination of exceptional intelligence and systematic observational access to the entire community, have to do with whatever the corporation's actual relationship to Springfield is? The show has not connected these dots. It probably was not intending to produce dots that could be connected in this way. But the accumulation is there. A highly educated man with unexplained reasons for remaining in a role far beneath his capabilities, operating a store that serves as the central observation point for an entire community's daily habits, in contact with a corporation that has unexplained power and an opaque internal culture. In a town where multiple layers of surveillance and influence and informal intelligence are already documented as operating, Apu sees everything that passes through the Quickie Mart. He remembers it, because he is brilliant and his memory is excellent and his attention is professional. He knows the purchase histories of every regular customer. He knows which Springfield residents have habits that diverge from what the community officially believes about them. He knows things about the people of this town that the people of this town do not know about each other. What does he do with that knowledge? Where does it go? The show will never say. Apu will continue standing behind his counter, counting his change and greeting his customers and maintaining the specific, warm efficiency that has made him one of Springfield's most beloved institutions for 3 decades. But the knowledge accumulates, and somewhere, in whatever structure actually runs Springfield, in the configuration of power and observation and information that sits beneath the town's official surface, someone is aware of what Apu has seen and what Apu knows, and what the Quickie Mart has been quietly providing to anyone with the interest and the access to use it. Thank you. Come again. End of Section 12. Section 13. The Simpsons house is wrong. The architecture of impossible space. There is something wrong with the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace, and it has nothing to do with the family inside it. The house itself, the physical structure, the architecture, the spatial relationships of the rooms that the show has depicted across 30-plus years of interior scenes, is wrong in a specific, documentable, deeply strange way that goes well beyond the normal inconsistencies of animated production. It is wrong in a way that suggests either extraordinary carelessness in the management of an extremely important setting, or something more interesting. The floor plan doesn't work. This is a fact. It has been exhaustively documented by fans who have spent considerable time mapping the house's interior against the exterior shots that establish its physical footprint, and the mapping doesn't resolve. The house that exists on the outside is not large enough to contain the house that exists on the inside. The rooms are too many and too large. The spaces implied by the interior scenes require a physical volume that the exterior footage does not provide. Some of this is explainable through the simple, practical realities of animated production. An animated show does not use a consistent set the way a live-action show uses a physical location. The house's rooms are drawn as needed for each episode, with the general goal of maintaining recognizable visual consistency rather than precise spatial accuracy. The kitchen is recognizable as the kitchen. The living room is recognizable as the living room. Nobody is running a tape measure. But here's where it gets interesting. The inconsistencies in the Simpson house are not random. They are not distributed evenly across the show's entire run in the way that random production inconsistencies would be distributed. They cluster around specific rooms, specific recurring features of the house's layout, in ways that suggest something more than careless production management. The basement is the most consistent example. The Simpson house has a basement in some episodes and does not have a basement in others. When the basement exists, it is a space of considerable size, apparently fully developed, used for various purposes across different episodes. When the basement doesn't exist, the space where it would be is simply not referenced. The show proceeds as if there is nothing beneath the first floor, no space, no infrastructure, nothing. This is played, when it is noticed at all, as a continuity joke, one of the show's running self-references to its own indifference to internal consistency. But the basement specifically, as opposed to any other spatial inconsistency in the house, has been the subject of more fan documentation and more specific attention than any other feature of the house's layout. Why the basement specifically? The episodes that prominently feature the basement tend to cluster around specific themes: things being hidden, things being discovered, spaces that exist outside of the family's normal awareness. The basement is the place where things are stored that are not meant to be accessible. It is the space below the surface of the family's domestic life, accessible but rarely visited, containing things that the family either doesn't know about or doesn't think about. In a real house, basements often contain the traces of previous occupants, the things left behind, the modifications made to the structure, the evidence of use patterns that predate the current family's residence. The Simpson house, which is in Springfield and has been there for the duration of the show, has a basement that contains the traces of all the previous occupants, all the previous uses, all the things that were stored there by people who are gone now. What is in the Simpson basement when it exists? The show has placed various things there across various episodes, not consistently enough to establish a canonical inventory, but frequently enough to establish that the basement is a space associated with concealment, with history, with the things that are beneath the surface of the family's visible life. The house also has an attic that appears and disappears with similar inconsistency. It has rooms whose spatial relationships to each other shift between episodes. It has windows that are in different locations depending on which scene requires which view. It has a backyard whose size and features change dramatically depending on what the episode needs to happen in it. All of this is, on its own, production inconsistency. But the Simpson house exists in Springfield, And Springfield is a place where physical reality has demonstrably been affected by forces that the show depicts without fully explaining. The nuclear plant has been shown to affect the local ecosystem in ways that go beyond simple chemical contamination. The town's geography is famously inconsistent in ways that the show treats as a running joke, but that, under the framework we've been building, suggests something more fundamental about the physical laws that govern Springfield's existence. If Springfield's physical reality is genuinely unstable, if the place occupies a specific position in relation to the forces that produce its reality, that makes certain kinds of physical consistency impossible, then the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace might simply be the most visible example of that instability. The family lives in a house that is as unstable as the town that contains it. The basement is there when the story needs a basement. The extra room exists when the story needs an extra room. The spatial logic resolves itself around the narrative requirements of each episode because in Springfield, narrative requirements are a form of physical force. This is either a very sophisticated piece of meta-commentary about the relationship between narrative and reality, or it is production inconsistency. Almost certainly it is production inconsistency. But in a show that has been running for 30 years and that has accumulated more intentional and unintentional layers of meaning than any other television show in history, even the production inconsistencies have become part of the text, part of what Springfield is, part of the accumulating evidence that this is a place where the normal rules do not apply and have never applied. The house exists. It is home. Its rooms are where the family's life happens. And if you draw a floor plan, the floor plan doesn't work. In Springfield, that is not a problem. In Springfield, that is simply the way it is. End of Section 13. Section 14. Barney Gumble and the Blackout Theory. The eyewitness who cannot testify. There is a man who has been present at every significant event in Springfield's modern history. He has been there for the catastrophes and the celebrations, the civic upheavals and the quiet disasters, the moments of genuine community and the moments that reveal the community's deepest dysfunction. He has been there, watching, for the entire run of the show, occupying a specific position in the social landscape of Springfield that gives him a perspective on the town's life that almost no other character shares. His name is Barney Gumble, and he cannot remember almost anything he has witnessed. Barney is the show's primary alcoholic character, a role he has occupied with a consistency and a depth that is simultaneously used for easy comedy and, in its best moments, treated with the specific kind of uncomfortable honesty that the show manages when it is being serious about something. He was, in the show's backstory, a bright and capable person before alcohol became the organizing principle of his life. There is a version of Barney, a version that exists primarily in flashback episodes and in the occasional sober episode, who is articulate, intelligent, possessed of a warmth and sensitivity that the alcoholic Barney is too impaired to consistently express. The alcoholism is real in the show's logic. It is not played purely for laughs, or at least not always. There are episodes where the show engages with what it actually means to be an alcoholic, what the loss involved is, what the life that could have been existed alongside the life that is. These episodes are among the show's most affecting. But the alcoholism also serves a specific structural function in the show that is worth examining. Barney is present everywhere. He is at the bar for every significant conversation that happens at the bar. He is in the crowd for every significant community event. He is in the background of an enormous number of Springfield's important moments, visible as a recurring face, present as a consistent witness. And he is unreliable. His memory is impaired. His testimony about anything he has witnessed is not credible in any formal sense, not because he is dishonest, but because the chronic alcohol exposure has genuinely compromised his ability to accurately encode and retrieve memories. He sees things, he forgets them, or he misremembers them, or he experiences them through a perceptual filter that distorts their significance and their detail. Barney is the perfect witness who cannot testify. He has been present for everything, and he can report almost nothing. This is played as a character trait and as a source of comedy. It is also, within the logic of Springfield's power structure, an incredibly convenient feature of the show's most omnipresent background character. Who benefits from having a permanent, omnipresent witness who cannot reliably report what he has witnessed? The answer, within the framework we've been building, is obvious. The same parties who benefit from all of Springfield's other mechanisms of collective amnesia and institutional unreliability. The power structure that runs Springfield, the informal configuration of Burns and Quimby and Fat Tony, and the various other interests that the show has depicted as constituting Springfield's actual governance, is best served by a community whose capacity for bearing witness is impaired. A community that cannot reliably report what it has seen, cannot organize coherent collective memories of what has happened, cannot build the shared factual foundation that accountability requires. Barney is the most extreme version of this, but he is not the only version. Springfield's collective memory is impaired for reasons we have examined at length: the environmental contamination, the psychiatric cycling, the social structures that produce and maintain collective amnesia. Barney's individual impairment is the personification of Springfield's collective impairment, the most concentrated version of the thing that the whole town does, rendered in a single specific person. He has been there for everything. He knows, somewhere beneath the alcohol fog, things about Springfield that have never been reported. He has witnessed events that shaped the town and that have been officially forgotten, that exist only in the unreliable, inaccessible record of a memory too damaged to be used. There are episodes where Barney comes close to sobriety. There are episodes where something breaks through the fog, where he is temporarily more present, more coherent, more capable of engaging with the world as it actually is, rather than through the specific quality of perception that the alcohol produces. In those episodes, he is touching something. He is reaching toward the version of himself that was present for everything without the fog, and toward the things that version of himself observed and remembered. He never quite gets there. The sobriety doesn't hold. The fog returns, and whatever it was that was almost accessible recedes back into the warm blur of Moe's bar and the warm familiarity of the drink that makes everything bearable. This is a portrait of alcoholism that is, in its own way, truthful. The show has never pretended that Barney's drinking is simply funny. It has always, beneath the comedy, maintained a sad awareness of what it costs him. But in the context we have been building, it is also something else. Barney Gumble is Springfield's unreliable narrator, its unchosen archivist, its keeper of a record that cannot be read. He has been present for 30 years of the show's history, watching, witnessing, absorbing, and the thing he has absorbed is stored somewhere in a mind too damaged to access it, protected from the possibility of testimony by the same damage that collected it. He knows Springfield. He has always known Springfield. And Springfield has always been safe from what he knows, because what he knows cannot be said. The drink is cold and the bar is warm, and Moe refills the glass, and Barney settles into the specific comfort of not having to know what he knows. And Springfield continues. And the beer flows, and the record accumulates in the fog where nothing can reach it. He is there every night. He will always be there. He has seen everything. He will never say. End of section 14. Section 15. Springfield Elementary is an experiment, what the school is actually testing. Springfield Elementary has been failing its students for the entire run of the show. This is not a contested observation. The show itself depicts the school's failure explicitly, repeatedly, and with a level of specificity that goes well beyond the broad strokes of educational satire. The building is decrepit. The funding is chronically inadequate. The staff ranges from competent but defeated to actively harmful. The educational outcomes are measurably poor. Bart Springfield has been in the 4th grade for 30 years. The school's test scores are documented failures. The principal is a fraud, as we have discussed. The guidance counselor is defined primarily by her capacity for causing damage in the name of helping. None of this is subtle. The show's critique of American public education, its chronic underfunding, its institutional indifference to individual students, its tendency to produce outcomes that are convenient for administrators rather than beneficial for children, is one of the most sustained and consistent arguments the series makes over its entire run. But the school is strange in ways that go beyond its failure as an educational institution. The school is strange in ways that, when you add them up, suggest something about what the school might actually be doing. Let's start with the testing. Springfield Elementary administers tests to its students with a frequency and variety that goes well beyond what ordinary school assessment requires. Standard state assessments, standardized tests, IQ evaluations, psychological assessments, aptitude batteries. The school's students are tested and evaluated and measured with a regularity that is played for comedy, but that accumulates into something more unusual than any single test episode would suggest. The results of these tests are handled strangely. When tests produce unremarkable results, the show moves on. When tests produce remarkable results when a student scores unexpectedly high or unexpectedly low, When the assessment reveals something about a student that diverges significantly from their classroom presentation, the show often depicts the result, generating a specific kind of institutional response that is more intense than the situation would normally require. Bart's testing history is the most extensively depicted example. Bart has been evaluated multiple times by the school's psychological and educational assessment apparatus, and the results have consistently revealed a gap between his assessed potential and his assessed performance. The school's response to this gap has never been to ask what would be required to close it, to design an educational approach that actually meets Bart where he is and moves him toward where he could be. The response has been to classify the gap in ways that are convenient for institutional management. Bart is classified as a behavioral problem, as having a learning difference, as requiring specific interventions that are consistently interventions that make him easier to manage rather than more capable of learning. This pattern, the gap between assessed potential and institutional response, recurs across multiple Springfield Elementary students, not just Bart. The school consistently produces assessment data that reveals something, and then responds to what is revealed in ways that do not follow from the revelation. The assessments appear to serve a function that is disconnected from their surface purpose of guiding educational decisions about individual students. What function? Springfield Elementary is located in a town where the nuclear plant has been producing environmental contamination for decades. The specific effects of that contamination on cognitive development, the specific ways that chronic low-level radiation exposure and the associated chemical pollutants affect the developing brains of children who grow up in the contamination zone are not well understood in the real world and are never directly addressed in the show. But they would produce measurable variation in the children's cognitive profiles. Not uniform degradation, radiation, and chemical exposure affects different people differently, at different doses, in different combinations, producing a spectrum of outcomes rather than a single outcome. Some children's development would be impaired. Some children's development might be altered in other ways, not impaired in the broad sense, but changed, differentiated, divergent from typical developmental patterns in specific and potentially interesting ways. A school whose student population has been subject to this kind of environmental exposure for decades would, if it were tracking outcomes carefully, accumulate an extraordinary body of data about the relationship between environmental exposure and cognitive development. It would have longitudinal data on how the same family's children are affected across generations. It would have comparative data on students with different levels of exposure, different residential locations within Springfield, different rates of consumption of contaminated water and food, different amounts of time spent in proximity to specific sources of contamination. This data would be enormously valuable to anyone trying to understand what the Springfield nuclear plant's environmental impact actually is. And it would be very specifically valuable to the interests that are invested in ensuring that understanding remains limited, that the specific mechanism connecting the plant's operation to the community's cognitive outcomes is never clearly identified or publicly established. Springfield Elementary's chronic inadequacy as an educational institution may be, in this reading, not simply a failure of public education funding and institutional management. It may be the surface presentation of an institution whose actual function has been shaped, over decades, by interests that require its assessment data to flow in a specific direction and its educational outcomes to remain within a specific range. The school keeps testing. The school's results keep disappearing into institutional files that produce no change in educational practice. The students keep performing at the levels that the environment produces. And somewhere in the accumulated assessment data of 30 years of Springfield Elementary and the test scores and IQ measurements and psychological evaluations that have been administered to the children of a contaminated community, for the entire run of the show, there is a record of what the nuclear plant has done that has never been published, never been publicly examined, and never been assembled into the kind of clear causal statement that would require someone to do something about it. The school knows. The school has always known. And the school keeps testing, and the data keeps accumulating, and the students keep failing, and everything continues exactly as it has always continued. Principal Skinner stands at the front of the school and maintains order, and the tests are administered, and the results are filed, and the children go home and drink their water and come back the next day. The school is open. The experiment continues. End of Section 15. Section 16. The Flanders family: 3 generations of trauma and the cost of being good. The Flanders family is, by many measures, the Simpson family's moral opposite. Where the Simpsons are dysfunctional, the Flanders are organized. Where Homer is selfish, Ned is generous. Where Bart is rebellious, Rod and Todd are obedient. Where Marge struggles to hold things together, Maude in the years of her life was the model of the supportive, engaged parent that the Simpson household has never quite been able to produce. The contrast is one of the show's most productive recurring dynamics, generating comedy and occasional genuine pathos in equal measure. But the Flanders family's goodness is, as we have already noted in earlier sections, a specifically complicated kind of goodness. A goodness that has been examined with enough care and enough consistency across the show's run to be something more than simple moral counterpoint to the Simpson family's chaos. The Flanders goodness is, at its core, a managed condition rather than a natural state. It requires effort. It requires vigilance. It requires the constant suppression of the thing underneath the goodness that the show has documented clearly enough to require attention. What is underneath the Flanders goodness? The show's most direct engagement with this question is in the episode Hurricane Neddy, which uses Ned's breakdown as the vehicle for a genuine examination of his psychological history. The episode reveals that Ned's childhood was characterized by a specific variety of parental failure. His parents, committed beatniks who had philosophical objections to the very concept of discipline, raised him without any of the external structure that children need to develop the capacity for self-regulation. Without external structure, Ned accumulated a child's natural rage and frustration and impulsivity without any of the tools to manage those experiences. By the time he entered the psychiatric system as a child, he was described as presenting with significant behavioral difficulties, the uncontrolled expression of what his family environment had left entirely unmanaged. The treatment he received was successful in the narrow sense that it produced the behavioral outcomes his treaters were aiming for: a well-controlled, externally cooperative, apparently well-regulated person. But it produced those outcomes through behavioral conditioning that essentially externalized the management of Ned's inner life, that trained him to produce specific behavioral outputs regardless of what his internal state was. Rather than developing his actual capacity to manage that state, Ned didn't become self-regulated. He became behaviorally controlled, which looks like self-regulation from the outside but operates entirely differently from the inside. This means that Ned's kindness, his patience, his forgiveness, his relentless positivity, all of the qualities that make him the show's moral opposite to Homer, are not natural expressions of who he is. They are the outputs of a behavioral system that was installed in him as a child and that runs regardless of what he actually feels. When his neighbor's selfishness kills his wife, Ned forgives him, and the forgiveness looks like grace, but the process that produces it is not grace. The process is a programmed response that the show has depicted with enough clarity to make its programmed quality unmissable if you're paying attention. This is a portrait of genuine psychological complexity rendered within the frame of a comedy show, and it is one of the things that makes The Simpsons consistently more interesting than its surface suggests. But there is more here than the show has explicitly said. Because Ned's history, the neglectful beatnik parents, the childhood behavioral difficulties, the institutional conditioning is not just Ned's history, it is a pattern that the show has, with remarkable consistency, traced across the Flanders family line in ways that suggest the pattern is generational. Ned's parents are depicted when they appear as people who are not simply eccentric in their parenting philosophy. They are people who are specifically avoiding something. Their commitment to non-discipline, which is so extreme that it prevented them from providing even the most basic structure that children need, has the quality of a reaction against something rather than a philosophy, chosen on its merits. People who have actually thought carefully about child development and concluded that complete permissiveness is best are rare. People who have experienced something that made all forms of authority and constraint feel dangerous or wrong, and who have translated that experience into a parenting philosophy, are considerably less rare. What did Ned's parents experience that made them afraid of authority? What happened in the Flanders family before the generation that produced Ned that shaped the family into people for whom all structure felt threatening? The show has never answered this question directly, but it has. Across the episodes that touch on Ned's family history, placed enough fragments to suggest an answer without committing to one. The fragments point toward a family history characterized by a specific kind of damage. The damage of people who were subject to authority that was genuinely dangerous, who learned to associate structure and constraint with harm, and who passed that association to their children in the form of a parenting philosophy that was itself a kind of harm. This is a generational pattern that has been documented in real family systems. The trauma of one generation produces the specific parenting failures that damage the next generation in a different, but related way. Ned's parents were damaged by authority. Their damage produced a parenting environment that failed to give Ned what he needed. Ned's childhood failure of development produced the specific psychological configuration that required behavioral conditioning. The conditioning produced the Ned Flanders. The show depicts a man of genuine warmth and genuine faith whose goodness is also a cage. And now Rod and Todd are being raised within that cage's shadow by a father who cannot express the rage that lives inside him, in a family system defined by the suppression of authentic emotional experience in favor of behavioral compliance, with a religious framework that provides external structure because the internal structures are insufficient. What will Rod and Todd carry forward? What will the next generation of the Flanders pattern look like? The show has never explored this, because Rod and Todd are perpetually young in Springfield's eternal present. But the show has, across its run, depicted enough of the Flanders family's transgenerational pattern to make the question feel genuinely weighty. Ned is good, the goodness is real, the faith is real, the warmth is real, and the thing underneath the goodness, the thing that the show has documented carefully across decades of depicting this character, is also real. And it is not good, and it is not going anywhere. And Ned manages it every day with the specific effort of a person who has been managing it all his life, and who will manage it until he dies. Next door, Homer falls off the couch. The laugh track runs. The episode continues. The cost of goodness in Springfield is very high. Ned Flanders has been paying it for 30 years. He will keep paying it for as long as the show runs. He will keep paying it with the specific quality of a person who has no choice, who was formed for this specific form of payment, who was shaped by forces he did not choose into exactly the person that this specific suffering requires. That is what it means to be good in Springfield. That is the tax the town levies on its most righteous resident. And Ned pays it, every week, with a cheerful wave over the fence, and Homer doesn't notice. And the show continues. End of Section 16. Section 17. The Lenny and Carl Enigma, the two most unexplained people in Springfield. There is a friendship at the center of The Simpsons that the show has never explained, never fully examined, and never resolved, despite returning to it across every single season of its 30-plus-year run. It is not the friendship between Homer and Moe, which is easily explained by proximity and shared addiction, and the specific bonds that form in places where people drink together regularly. It is not the friendship between Homer and Barney, which is a relationship of long duration and real emotional depth that the show has treated seriously on multiple occasions. It is not any of the more obvious relationships in the show's ensemble. It is the friendship between Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson. Lenny and Carl are Homer's co-workers at the nuclear plant. They are his primary social companions outside of his family and his bar. They appear in an enormous number of episodes, across the entire run of the show, as a unit, almost always together, almost always as a pair, almost always in each other's company, in a way that suggests a bond that predates their appearances in the show and that runs deeper than the surface comedy of their friendship would suggest. They are, in a specific and documentable way, the show's most mysterious central characters. Lenny and Carl have almost no established backstory. They exist, in the show's world, almost entirely in the present, tense present in scenes, present in conversations, present as witnesses to and participants in Springfield's ongoing life, but without the kind of established personal history that the show has given to most of its other significant recurring characters. Homer has his childhood, his family history, his mother's story, his father's history. Marge has her family, her background, her relationship history with Homer. Ned has his psychological history. Even Barney has a documented before and after that the show returns to with some regularity. Lenny and Carl have almost none of this. What little backstory the show has provided has been inconsistent, contradictory, and treated with the specific lightness that suggests the writers are not particularly invested in the specific details that the backstory elements are serving particular episode needs, rather than building toward any coherent account of who these characters are. This is itself strange, because Lenny and Carl are not background characters. They are significant recurring presences in the show's most central location, the nuclear plant, and in the show's most recurring social setting, the bar. They are present for a remarkable proportion of the show's important moments. They are, in many episodes, the witnesses whose presence validates the significance of what is happening. They are not peripheral. They are central. Why do we know so little about them? Part of the answer is almost certainly practical. Lenny and Carl are support characters, functioning primarily to provide Homer with an audience and a social context, and deep backstory for support characters is a resource investment that the show directs toward its primary characters rather than its secondary ones. This is a real consideration, and it explains part of the pattern, but the part it doesn't explain is the specific quality of the not knowing. Lenny and Carl don't just lack backstory, they have a quality of deliberate mystery about them that goes beyond ordinary narrative omission. They are depicted, particularly in the episodes that engage with them most directly, as people who are not quite fully legible, who have an interiority that the show gestures toward without revealing, who have a relationship to each other that is more complex than the surface presentation suggests, who occupy positions in Springfield's world that their visible social role does not quite account for. The relationship between them is the most consistent source of this quality. Lenny and Carl are inseparable in a way that the show has, across its run, depicted with an undertone of something that it has never committed to naming directly. They are together constantly. They care about each other with an intensity that goes beyond casual workplace friendship. Their relationship has been the subject of many years of fan discussion about its exact nature, discussion that the show has acknowledged through a consistent pattern of jokes that suggest the writers are aware of the discussion and are deliberately not resolving it. What is the relationship between Lenny and Carl? The show has never said. The show has spent 30 years declining to say. The specific pattern of that, declining the jokes that acknowledge the question without answering it, the episodes that come close and then retreat, the consistent proximity and genuine mutual investment that the show depicts without framing, suggests that the not saying is itself a choice, that there is something specific the show is aware of and declining to commit to. This is either the show's longest-running deliberate ambiguity, maintained for the specific comedy it generates, or it is the show's most prolonged and elaborate avoidance of something that is, within its world, actually true, but that it has never found the right moment or the right narrative vehicle to say directly. In either case, the effect is the same. Lenny and Carl are the most intimate, ongoing relationship in the show's world that the show has never examined, has never named, and has never resolved. Now let's consider their professional situation. Lenny and Carl work at the nuclear plant with Homer. They are his equals, roughly, within the plant's hierarchy. Fellow employees in the same general tier of the plant's workforce, subject to the same management, doing the same kind of work in the same building. They have been working there for the entire run of the show, alongside Homer, in proximity to the same reactors, breathing the same air, exposed to the same environmental conditions that we have already discussed at length. And yet Lenny and Carl seem, in a specific and hard-to-articulate way, less affected by those conditions than Homer is. Homer's impairment is consistent, documented, and dramatic. Lenny and Carl display none of the specific cognitive and emotional impairment that Homer displays. They are not brilliant, but they are functional in ways that Homer consistently is not. They can plan. They can maintain consistent attitudes toward things. They can form and express complex opinions. They navigate Springfield's social world with a competence that Homer never achieves. Why are Lenny and Carl apparently unaffected by the conditions that have produced Homer's chronic impairment? Several possibilities suggest themselves. They could simply have constitutions that are more resistant to the environmental effects. Individual variation in response to environmental stressors is real, and it is possible that Lenny and Carl simply don't show the same susceptibility that Homer does. They could have external factors in their lives that provide some buffering, better nutrition, different residential locations, different exposure levels, or they could know something about the plant's conditions that Homer doesn't, and have taken some form of precaution that Homer hasn't, which would require that someone told them something that they have access to information about the plant's actual operational conditions and its actual effects on human health that Homer, conspicuously, does not have. Who would give them that information? Why them, and not Homer? And what does their continued presence at the plant, with apparent knowledge of what it does, tell us about what they're actually doing there? The show doesn't answer any of these questions. It never has and never will. Lenny and Carl will continue to occupy their positions in Springfield's social landscape. The friends who are always there, the witnesses who are always watching, the relationship that is never named, and the specific mysteries of their situation will continue to accumulate in the background, one episode at a time, adding to the already substantial body of unexplained strangeness that is Springfield's most reliable feature. They know something. They have always known something. And the friendship that has kept them together for 30 years, the relationship that the show has refused to name and refused to resolve, is built on a shared knowledge of what they know, a mutual understanding that is never expressed because it doesn't need to be expressed between people who have been carrying the same thing for the same amount of time. They are still there. They will always be there. And what they carry between them, what binds them in ways the show has never been willing to say directly, will stay between them for as long as the show runs. Some things in Springfield are too important to name. Lenny and Carl are one of them. End of Section 17. Section 18. The Simpsons' legacy, why this show cannot end, and what it means that it hasn't. There is a specific question about The Simpsons that nobody asks directly, even though it is arguably the most important question you can ask about a show of this duration and this cultural significance. Not what does it mean, or is it still good, or why does it keep running? These are questions that have been asked extensively, that have generated enormous amounts of cultural commentary and fan debate and academic analysis. The question nobody asks directly is this: what does it mean that we have not let it end? Because The Simpsons' ending is a choice that is available. The show's creators could have ended it at any point in its run. Its original creator, Matt Groening, has expressed ambivalence about its continuation on multiple occasions. Its most significant writer, Sam Simon, died in 2015. Harry Shearer, who voices multiple major characters, has had public conflicts with the production over the show's continuation. The show has faced, across its run, multiple junctures at which it could have been concluded, in which the narrative arc of the series could have been given an ending that reflected on everything it had built and released its characters from the loop. The show has never taken any of those junctures. It has continued, season after season, renewal after renewal, the same characters in the same configurations doing the same things in the same town, and the most fundamental reason it has continued is that the audience for whom it continues has never stopped watching. We have not let it end. This is a fact about the audience, not about the show. The show continues because the economics of its continuation are sound, and the economics of its continuation are sound because the audience remains. We are the reason Springfield cannot end. We are the reason that Bart stays 10 and Lisa stays 8 and Homer keeps going back to the plant and the water keeps flowing from the contaminated river and the cycle keeps repeating. We are the closed system. Or rather, we are the force that keeps the system closed. This is worth sitting with seriously because it is uncomfortable in a specific way. The Simpsons is, as we have established across the preceding sections of this examination, a show that depicts a community trapped in its own patterns, unable to break the cycles that produce its dysfunction, subject to forces it cannot see or name that maintain those cycles against the interests of the community's members. This is the show's most sustained and most honest subject. It has been depicting this condition for 30 years with a fidelity that has never broken. And we, the audience, have been the force that maintains the condition, not maliciously, not through any conspiracy or deliberate choice to harm the characters we love, but through the specific mechanism of our attachment, through the love we have for the show and the characters and the world, the love that expresses itself in the form of continued watching, which is the only form that the mechanism requires. Our love for Springfield is the force that keeps Springfield locked. Our desire to return to it, week after week, season after season, year after year, is the specific force that prevents the loop from breaking. If we stopped watching, the show would end. If the show ended, the loop would break. Bart would age, Lisa would grow up, Homer would retire or die or achieve some resolution of the central tension of his life. Marge would become fully herself in ways that the show's premise has always prevented. The children would become adults. The patterns would change. Time would pass. None of that can happen as long as we keep watching. Our love prevents it. Our attachment to the specific forms of these characters, to Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 and Homer at whatever age he eternally is the lock that keeps the loop from opening. This is the show's deepest and most unspoken observation about its relationship to its audience. It knows that we love it. It knows that our love is the specific mechanism of its continuation, and it has been, with increasing self-awareness as the years have accumulated, depicting the consequences of that love, the stasis, the recycling, The inability of anything to fundamentally change in ways that reflect back on the relationship between the show and the audience that keeps it alive. The Simpsons is a show about a community that is trapped in its own patterns. It is also a show that is itself trapped in its own patterns by the force of its audience's attachment. The community within the show cannot change because the show depicts their situation as unchangeable. The show cannot change because the audience's love requires it to remain what it has always been. And the audience cannot stop loving it because Springfield has become genuinely home, a place more vivid and more emotionally resonant for many of its viewers than any place they have actually lived. We are watching a mirror. The mirror shows us Springfield, and if we look at the mirror long enough, if we watch it closely enough, we start to see something in the mirror that is not Springfield, but that is related to Springfield, that shares Springfield's specific quality of being unable to change, of cycling through the same patterns, of knowing what is wrong and not being able to do anything about it. We see ourselves? This is not a comfortable observation. It is also, I think, the observation that 30 years of this show has been building toward, not explicitly, not as a planned statement, but as the accumulated product of genuine creative work over a very long time. The show that was always about America has become a show about the relationship between America and the art it loves, about what it means that we keep returning to a portrait of our own dysfunction with the specific warmth of homecoming. We love Springfield because Springfield is honest about something we cannot quite say about ourselves. It exaggerates, it caricatures, it renders in cartoon form the specific varieties of dysfunction that we live with in versions that are slightly less dramatic and slightly less funny. But the exaggeration is faithful to the original. The cartoon is recognizable as what it is a cartoon of, and the recognition, the laugh of acknowledgement at something that is funny because it is true, is the specific pleasure that has kept 30 years of audiences returning to a show about a family that never changes in a town, that never heals. The mysteries of Springfield are the mysteries of ourselves. The closed system is us. The lock on the loop is our love. And we keep returning because we are not ready to let it end, because letting it end would mean admitting that 30 years have passed, that we are older, that the world has changed, that the couch we sat on as children is gone. As long as The Simpsons runs, none of that is true. As long as the loop keeps looping, the couch is still there. The family is still intact. Bart is still 10. We are not ready to let that go. We have never been ready. And so Springfield continues, and the water flows, and the plant hums, and the same mistakes are made in new configurations, and we watch, and we laugh, and we go home. We go home to Springfield. We always go home to Springfield. Because Springfield is where the family is. And the family never changes. And the family never ages. And the family is always there when we need them. On the couch, in the same house, in the same town, in the same loop that we built around them because we could not bear for them to become something we didn't recognize. This is the final mystery. Not what Springfield is, not why nobody can leave, not who shot Burns or where the missing children went or what is actually in Sector 7G. Those are the surface mysteries. The final mystery is simpler and harder. Why do we love something so much that our love has become its cage? Why are we so attached to a portrait of dysfunction that we have kept it running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive? What is it about Springfield, about the yellow skin and the four fingers and the ageless children and the contaminated water and the cycling ward and the shadow government and the professor behind the bar and the janitor in the boiler room and the minister with his trains? What is it about all of that, rendered in bright animation with a laugh track and a couch gag, that makes us come back? The answer is the same answer it has always been. Because they are us. Because Springfield is our town. Because Homer is our father, and Marge is our mother, and Bart is who we wanted to be, and Lisa is who we should have been, and Maggie, silent Maggie, watching everything and saying nothing. Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden, that we never quite let speak, that we carry through our lives in the same way she carries herself through Springfield. Enormous eyes behind the pacifier, watching, processing, waiting for a moment that may never come. That is what the show is. That is what it has always been. And that is why it runs. And why it will keep running, and why the loop never breaks, and why the family never ages, and why every Sunday night or whenever you watch now, on whatever device, in whatever year you're watching this, you can go back, you can go home, you can sit on the couch, and the family will be there. They are always there. Springfield doesn't end. Springfield doesn't have to end. Springfield just has to wait. and you will come back, and you will be home. And the thing that makes you feel like home will also be the thing that traps the family in the loop. And you will know this, somewhere. And you will watch anyway. Because that is what love does in Springfield. That is what love does everywhere. End of section 18. End of complete script. Total sections. 18. Approximate running time. 5 hours. Title. 5 hours of unknown Simpsons. Mysteries. So disturbing the writers refuse to address them. Section 19. The mystery of Springfield's founding, who built this town and why. Every American town has a founding myth. It is one of the fundamental requirements of American civic identity. The story of the people who came first, who staked their claim, who built the first structures and named the streets and established the specific character that the community would carry forward through time. The founding myth is always somewhat mythological, in the technical sense of being a story whose function is to establish identity and provide a usable account of origins, rather than to accurately describe what actually happened. But it is always present. The story is told. The founders are honored. The town knows, at least at the level of official civic memory, where it came from and why. Springfield has a founding. The show has depicted it in multiple episodes, from multiple angles, with the characteristic inconsistency that marks all of Springfield's historical depictions. But unlike most of Springfield's internal contradictions, the inconsistencies in the founding story are not simply the product of careless continuity management. They follow a specific pattern that suggests something is being withheld from Springfield's official account of its own origins. Let's start with what the show has established across the episodes that engage with Springfield's founding. The town was founded by a man named Jebediah Springfield. This much is consistent. Jebediah Springfield is Springfield's founding father, its civic patron, the man whose statue stands in the town square and whose legacy is celebrated annually in Springfield Day, the civic holiday that marks the town's founding. He is, in the town's official memory, a figure of uncomplicated virtue, brave, visionary, the kind of founding figure that civic mythology requires. The show undermines this in one of its most beloved episodes, Lisa the Iconoclast, which reveals that the historical Jebediah Springfield was a pirate, a fraud, and quite possibly a murderer, that the civic mythology that Springfield has built around its founder is entirely fabricated, maintained by the town's historical society as a deliberate construction rather than a reflection of historical reality. The real Jebediah was Hans Sprungfeld, a morally complicated man whose actual history bore no resemblance to the virtuous founder legend. This revelation is presented as a satire of the gap between civic mythology and historical reality, and it works brilliantly on that level. But within the show's own logic, it raises a question that the satire doesn't quite address. If the founding mythology is entirely fabricated, if the town's official account of its origins has been deliberately constructed to conceal the actual history, then what is the actual history? Who actually founded Springfield? And why? And what was the specific purpose that the founding served? The show's various founding episodes provide fragments that don't quite cohere. Different accounts place different people at the founding for different reasons. The geography of the original settlement is inconsistent with the geography that subsequent episodes establish. The founding's relationship to the various civic structures, the church, the school, the early commercial establishments, shifts depending on which episode is depicting it. But across all these inconsistent versions, certain elements persist. Springfield was founded in a location that was chosen specifically, rather than accidentally, in a place that had qualities that made it suitable for a specific purpose, not simply the nearest available land or the place where the founding party stopped because they were tired of traveling. The specific qualities of the location are never clearly stated, but the show's various founding episodes depict the choice of location as deliberate, as the product of assessment rather than chance. What made Springfield's specific location desirable to its founders? In the context of everything else we have established about Springfield, the answer to this question might be simpler than it appears. The location has specific geological features that include proximity to water, which has become Springfield's primary contamination vector. It has geographical features that have made it, in the show's own mythology, somehow resistant to easy external investigation. The multiple conflicting accounts of its location that we discussed in the original broadcast have a real-world analog in the show's own inconsistent depiction of how Springfield relates to the surrounding geography. Was Springfield founded in its specific location because that location had specific qualities that would eventually be useful for the kind of industrial operation that the nuclear plant represents? Was the founding, whether by the historical Hans Sprungfeld or by whoever he was fronting for a claim-staking operation rather than a settlement operation, the establishment of a presence in a specific place for specific resource-related reasons that the founding mythology was subsequently constructed to conceal? The show has never answered this. The founding mythology is a joke about American civic mythology in general, a satire of the gap between the stories communities tell about themselves and the realities those stories are designed to cover. But jokes land differently when they are made by a show that has, across 30 years, built a world in which the gap between official narrative and actual reality is the defining feature of every institution in the town. Springfield tells a specific story about its origins. The story is false. The real story has been suppressed. And the real story, whatever it is, would explain something important about why Springfield is what it is and why it has become what it has become. The statue of Jebediah Springfield stands in the town square. The statue is of a man who did not exist in the form the statue depicts. Springfield gathers around the statue for civic celebrations and school field trips and moments of community solidarity, organized around a fiction, celebrating an origin that never was. This is, the show suggests, how all founding myths work. It is also, in Springfield specifically, something that has consequences that extend beyond the ordinary consequences of civic mythology. Springfield's false founding story is not just a harmless civic narrative. It is the first and most fundamental of the town's many practiced suppressions, the original lie on which all subsequent lies have been constructed. Every institution in Springfield was built on that foundation. Every piece of Springfield's civic reality rests, ultimately, on the specific lies that were told about why this place was founded and by whom and for what purpose. And those lies have been maintained, generation after generation, with the specific vigilance that Springfield applies to all its uncomfortable truths, through collective agreement, through institutional pressure, through the active management of any evidence that would complicate the official story. The statue stands, the story is told, Springfield Day is celebrated, and beneath the celebration, in the specific silence that surrounds all of Springfield's suppressed truths, the real founding story waits patient, unspoken, maintained in the same darkness where everything else in Springfield that is true but inconvenient is maintained. End of Section 19. Section 20. Lisa Simpson and the burden of being right, the Cassandra of Springfield. In the mythology of ancient Troy, there was a prophetess named Cassandra who was given the gift of true prophecy by the god Apollo, and then cursed, after she refused his advances, to never be believed. She saw what was coming. She told what she saw, and nobody listened. The disaster came, as she had said it would, and the people who had not listened to her were destroyed by the thing she had tried to warn them about. And she was right, and it did not help her, and it did not help them. Lisa Simpson is the Cassandra of Springfield. This is not a new observation. The show has, across its run, been remarkably explicit about the parallel. Lisa is consistently the character who perceives Springfield's problems most clearly, who articulates them most accurately, and who is most systematically ignored when she does. She is the show's recurring portrait of the specific suffering of someone who is right in a community that cannot afford to believe her. But the Cassandra parallel goes deeper than the show usually allows itself to acknowledge. Because in the myth, Cassandra's curse is not simply that she isn't believed. The curse is more specific than that. She sees the truth and tells the truth and is ignored, which means she is perpetually in the position of watching disasters unfold that she already knows are coming, that she has already tried to prevent, that she cannot prevent because the people who could act on her warnings will not. She is not protected from the disasters by her foreknowledge. She experiences the disasters with the specific additional weight of knowing they could have been avoided, that the gap between her knowing and others acting is the gap that allows the disaster to occur. This is Lisa's position in Springfield, rendered in the specific register of a children's character in a family comedy. She sees what's wrong. She says what's wrong. She is ignored, or accommodated superficially and then ignored, or temporarily taken seriously in ways that produce no lasting change. And the thing she saw coming comes, and Springfield resets around it, and Lisa is left in the specific position of the person who knew and said and was not heard. Across 30 seasons of episodes, This cycle has repeated itself more times than it can be fully cataloged. Lisa has identified environmental problems that the community subsequently ignored. She has identified institutional failures that the community normalized. She has identified moral and political problems with a clarity and a specificity that is genuinely extraordinary for an 8-year-old, or for a character of any age, and the community has responded to each identification with the full range of mechanisms it has developed for managing unwelcome truths. Dismissal, condescension, temporary accommodation followed by forgetting, and occasionally the specific collective pressure that turns the person who named the problem into the person who is the problem. The last of these is the most insidious and the most consistent. Lisa's righteousness, her genuine intellectual and moral seriousness, her commitment to acting on the things she perceives regularly, makes her the target of community response that positions her as a killjoy, a spoilsport, someone whose insistence on truth is itself the problem, because the truth she insists on is inconvenient for everyone who benefits from its continued suppression. The show is aware of this dynamic, and it depicts it with real honesty in its best Lisa episodes. It knows what it means to be the person who sees clearly in a community that has organized itself around not seeing. It knows the specific loneliness of that position, the loneliness of someone who cannot unsee what they have seen, who cannot stop saying what needs to be said, in a community where saying what needs to be said produces isolation rather than solidarity. But there is something the show has never quite fully engaged with: the cumulative weight of this position across 30 years. Lisa has been in this position for her entire depicted life. She has been right about things, repeatedly, with a consistency and a clarity that should, in a world that operated by any rational learning mechanism, have produced some updating of the community's relationship to her assessments. In a world where people learn from experience, the person who is right repeatedly eventually develops credibility. Not universal credibility, not immunity from being ignored, but a track record that makes subsequent dismissal more costly and less automatic. Springfield is not a world where this kind of updating occurs. The show has established this thoroughly, across every section we have examined. Springfield does not learn, Springfield does not update, Springfield cycles and resets, and the same positions are occupied by the same characters making the same mistakes, and no amount of demonstrated accuracy at predicting those mistakes produces any change in how the person who predicted them is received. Lisa has been right for 30 years. Lisa is still ignored. The track record is there: 30 seasons of documented instances in which Lisa identified a problem, was ignored, and then was proved correct by subsequent events. And none of it matters, because Springfield's capacity to acknowledge that track record is as impaired as every other form of Springfield's critical thinking. What does it do to a person, even a cartoon person, even a character in a long-running animated comedy, to be perpetually, consistently, demonstrably right and perpetually ignored? What does it do to the development of a self to spend your entire conscious life in the position of knowing and being unseen? The show has glimpsed the answer in its best episodes. There are Lisa episodes that touch the specific quality of her loneliness with a vividness that goes well beyond what the comedy format usually allows. There are episodes where the camera stays on Lisa's face long enough to see something that the comedy cannot quite contain, something that is recognizable as the specific, accumulated weight of someone who has been the Cassandra of their community for too long. And then the episode ends, and Lisa resets, and she is 8 years old again. And the next episode begins, and she sees the next thing that needs to be seen, and she says the next thing that needs to be said, and the community ignores her, and the pattern continues. This is Lisa Simpson's life. This is what it means to be the most intelligent person in Springfield. This is the specific tax that Springfield levies on its most perceptive resident, not the tax it levies on Ned Flanders, which is the suppression of rage and the performance of goodness. The tax Springfield levies on Lisa is more fundamental. It is the suppression of affect, the systematic prevention of her intelligence from having any lasting impact on anything, the maintenance of a gap between her seeing and the community's acting that ensures her perception is perpetually wasted. She sees the fish with 3 eyes and connects it to the plant. She is 8 years old and she understands what the fish means, and she says it. And the community eats the fish and moves on. And she sees the next thing. And she says the next thing. And she will keep doing this for as long as the show runs, as long as the loop loops, as long as we watch. She will keep being right. She will keep being ignored. And somewhere in that specific, sustained, 30-year experience of being right and being ignored, There is a portrait of something that the show has always been about at its most honest level. The gap between what a person knows and what the world is willing to do with what that person knows. That gap is Springfield. That gap has always been Springfield. Lisa stands at the edge of it, looking down, and she says what she sees. And Springfield continues. End of Section 20. Section 21. Moe's phone. The longest-running joke and what it actually means? There is a joke in The Simpsons that is arguably the most repeated joke in the show's history. It is not a complicated joke. It is, in its structure, almost perfectly simple. Bart calls Moe's Tavern. He asks for a patron by a fake name, a name that, when spoken aloud by Moe as he calls it out to the bar, constitutes a crude joke. The bar laughs. Moe realizes he has been fooled. Moe makes violent threats. The call ends. The joke repeats, in a new variation, in a future episode. This joke has been running since the show's earliest seasons. It ran through the golden era. It has continued through every subsequent era. It is one of the show's most reliable recurring gags, one of the few structural elements that has persisted with minimal variation across the show's entire run. Most people, when they think about this joke, think about it as exactly what it appears to be. A simple running gag that generates easy laughs from the combination of Bart's trickster energy and Moe's explosive, violent reaction to being made a fool of. The joke is funny. It has been funny for 30 years, which is an impressive feat for any joke and a remarkable feat for a joke this simple. But here's what nobody talks about. The fact that Moe keeps answering the phone. This is the mystery at the center of the joke that nobody asks about. Because the joke is so reliably funny that nobody needs to push on it to get more out of it. But if you step back from the comedy and look at what the joke is actually depicting, you notice something that is genuinely strange. Moe has been prank called by the same child, using the same basic format, for more than 30 years of broadcast time. He knows this child. He knows the child's name, his voice, his family, his home address. He lives in the same town as this child. He serves this child's father as a regular customer. The prank call is not an anonymous intrusion from an unknown adversary. It is a completely documented, fully identified source of recurring humiliation. And Moe keeps answering the phone, not because he doesn't know who is calling. The show has established repeatedly that Moe knows exactly who is calling, but because he answers anyway, every time, and allows himself to be humiliated again, and makes his violent threats, and hangs up, and waits for the next call. Why? The straightforward reading is that Moe is a specific type of person, the type who cannot stop engaging with the thing that humiliates them, who returns to the source of their suffering the way certain people return to abusive relationships or addictive substances, because the engagement, even painful, is preferable to the alternative. Moe is lonely. He knows the prank calls are coming. He answers them anyway because any interaction, even humiliating interaction, is better than the silence of the bar between customers. This is a coherent and in many ways genuinely sad reading of the joke, and it is consistent with the show's broader portrait of Moe as a man defined by loneliness and the specific variety of suffering that accompanies a life spent on the margins of belonging. But there is another reading, one that is available only when you know the things we have been establishing in this video about Springfield's power structures and information networks, and the specific roles that various Springfield characters play in the informal architecture of the town. Moe's Bar is, as we established earlier, a location that may serve functions beyond the obvious one. It is a social hub, a place where Springfield's residents gather and talk, a space where the kind of conversation happens that does not happen in the more visible, more monitored contexts of civic and professional life. Moe is the person who hears these conversations, who is present for the specific quality of disclosure that happens when people have been drinking in a comfortable space with trusted companions. And Bart keeps calling to tell him something. The prank calls are always a fake name, always a crude joke. But they are also always a connection, a consistent, recurring point of contact between the Simpson household and Moe's Bar, a link that has been maintained for the entire run of the show, that persists regardless of whatever else is happening in the respective lives of the caller and the called. What if the prank call is not purely prank? What if the format, the fake name, the crude joke, the violent response, is a ritual whose surface content conceals a different function? What if Bart's calls to Moe are, beneath the joke, a check-in, a regular pulse that confirms the connection between these two specific nodes in Springfield's social network? This is probably not what the writers intended. This is almost certainly an overreading of a simple, funny, recurring bit. But in a show that has accumulated 30 years of detail, in a world where the accumulation of detail has produced patterns that the individual details were never designed to produce, even a simple recurring bit looks different when you know enough about the context to read it differently. The calls keep coming, Mo keeps answering, the joke keeps working. And in the specific rhythm of the connection, the call, the false name, the realization, the threat, the end there, is something that functions like a heartbeat, regular, persistent, maintained across decades without interruption. The pulse of a connection that both parties return to regardless of everything else that is happening. Mo's phone rings. Mo answers. Bart speaks. The joke continues. And somewhere in the simple structure of the longest-running gag in the history of American animation, something is being maintained that is more than a prank, and something less than communication, and something that, after 30 years, you might almost call a relationship. End of Section 21. Section 22. The complete picture: Springfield as a living system and the question of escape. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have visited its psychiatric ward and documented its patterns of cycling impairment. We have cataloged its missing children and sat with the specific silence that surrounds their absence. We have mapped the shadow government that runs beneath its formal institutions, followed the shadow to the nuclear plant and back, traced the connections between Fat Tony and Mayor Quimby and Mr. Burns, and the specific configuration of informal power that constitutes Springfield's actual governance. We have examined Sideshow Bob's impossible persistence, and Groundskeeper Willie's impossible knowledge, and Reverend Lovejoy's impossible stasis, and Patty and Selma's impossible secret, and the show within a show that mirrors the show that contains it. We have looked at Moe's bar and the Quickie Mart and the house that shouldn't contain the rooms it contains. We have traced the founding myth to the lies at its foundation. We have sat with Lisa's burden and Barney's fog and the specific friendship that has no name. We have, in other words, assembled a picture of Springfield that is considerably more detailed and considerably more disturbing than the one the show presents at surface level. Not because the show is hiding this picture, exactly as we have established repeatedly, most of what we have been examining is visible in the show's own content, present in the details and the patterns, and the accumulated weight of 30 years of specific choices. But because the picture only becomes visible at a certain scale, a certain distance, a certain accumulation of detail that requires you to step back from any individual episode and look at the whole thing at once. What does the whole thing look like? It looks like a living system, a specific, complex, self-regulating system that has been operating for more than 30 years, with a consistency and a coherence that is more than accidental, that has the quality of design. Even if the design is distributed across thousands of individual decisions made by hundreds of different people, rather than the product of any single unified intention. The system has inputs, new residents, new characters, outside events, cultural changes. The system processes these inputs, metabolizes them, absorbs their novelty, fits them into the existing framework, produces outputs that are recognizably Springfield in quality regardless of what was put in. The system has regulatory mechanisms, the psychiatric ward, the legal machinery of collective amnesia, the environmental contamination that maintains baseline cognitive impairment, the shadow government that manages specific threats to the system's equilibrium. The system has feedback loops. The impaired population produces the dysfunctional institutions that produce the impaired population. The contamination produces the compliance that allows the contamination to continue. The poverty of accountability produces the poverty of accountability. It is, as a system, remarkably stable, more stable than most living systems, because most living systems are subject to the ordinary forces of change, aging, death, generational succession, external pressure, internal evolution. Springfield's living system is insulated from most of these forces by the specific features we have examined. The characters don't age, the community doesn't accumulate institutional learning, the external world's attempts to hold it accountable are consistently managed away. The question that this picture raises, the question it has been building toward through every section of this examination, is whether escape from this system is possible. Not escape in the narrative sense. Not the question of whether the show will ever end and free its characters from the loop. That question has an answer. Yes, eventually, when the show's economics no longer support its continuation, the show will end and the characters will be released. This is a meta-narrative answer to a meta-narrative question. The question I'm asking is different. Within the logic of Springfield as a living system, within the internal rules that the show has built over 30 years of specific choices, is there a pathway out? Is there a force or a combination of forces that could, operating within Springfield's own logic, produce the kind of change that would break the cycle? The show has, across its run, imagined Springfield changing. It has done this primarily in its future episodes, the flash-forwards that show Springfield at various points forward in time, with various configurations of change applied to its characters and its social landscape. In these episodes, things do change. Characters age. The specific dynamics that define the show's present are modified by the passage of time into something recognizably different. The episodes demonstrate that within the show's imaginative universe, change is possible. Springfield can be different from what it is. The flash-forwards are always temporary. They are always episodes rather than the show itself. The show returns to its present after each one, and Springfield is as it was, and the loop continues. But the flash-forwards exist, which means the imagination that produced the show is capable of imagining Springfield differently. The capacity is there. The vision of an alternative is possible. What would it require, within Springfield's own logic, to make that alternative actual rather than hypothetical? The answer that the accumulated evidence points to is disarmingly simple. It would require the people of Springfield to stop forgetting, not to immediately stop drinking the contaminated water, not to immediately dismantle the nuclear plant, not to immediately prosecute the shadow government or close the ward or send Sideshow Bob to a facility from which he genuinely cannot escape. These changes might eventually follow, but the precondition for any of them is simpler and more fundamental. The people of Springfield would have to stop engaging in the systematic amnesia that the show has documented as the town's primary defense mechanism. They would have to remember the dome. They would have to remember Principal Tamzarian. They would have to remember the three-eyed fish and ask the question it implies. They would have to hold on to the specific uncomfortable truths that the town's institutional mechanisms are designed to process into forgettability. And they would have to hold on to them long enough, together, to do something with them. Is this possible in Springfield? The show's accumulated evidence suggests it is not. The impairment is too deep. The mechanisms are too well developed. The systems that produce the forgetting are too entrenched to be easily overcome. But the show's flash-forwards suggest that it is not impossible that there is a version of Springfield, available to the imagination that produced the show, in which the loop breaks and the characters grow and time passes and things change. That version is not the show we have. That version is the show we might have had, or the show that might eventually come when the show finally ends and the characters are released from the loop into whatever kind of narrative ending the writers give them. Until then, Springfield is as it is. The system runs, the loop continues, the water flows. But the vision of the alternative exists. It has always existed, and the show has been placing it in front of us, in those flash-forwards, in those glimpses of a Springfield where time has passed and things have changed, as a reminder that the loop is not the only possibility, that there is something on the other side of the reset button that is worth reaching for, even if the show cannot yet reach it. Lisa is 8 years old in the eternal Springfield present. She is also, in the flash-forward episodes, 23, 30, 40, a grown woman who has become the person the show has always suggested she might become. A person who has used the intelligence and the sensitivity and the moral seriousness that Springfield spent her childhood trying to suppress. A person who has, somehow, escaped enough of Springfield's gravity to become fully herself. That Lisa exists. She exists in the show's imagination. And she is the answer to the question of whether escape is possible, not the answer to whether it is easy, or likely, or something the show will show us in its current run, but the answer to whether it is possible. It is possible. The show knows it is possible. It has shown it to us, briefly, in the episodes where it allows the future to be different from the present. And then it returns to the present, and the loop continues. And Lisa is 8 years old, and Springfield is as it is. But the glimpse was real. The possibility is real. And somewhere in the space between what Springfield is and what the show's imagination knows it could be, the seeds of everything that Springfield refuses to allow itself to become are waiting, patient, and persistent, for the moment when the loop finally breaks. That moment may never come. The loop may simply continue until the show ends, and the characters are released into whatever exists after Springfield. But until then, until the moment of release, Whenever it comes, we can do what we have been doing in this examination. We can look at Springfield with the clarity it lacks within itself. We can see the patterns. We can name the mechanisms. We can hold on to the uncomfortable truths that Springfield's residents are prevented from holding on to. We can be, for Springfield, the witness that Springfield has no capacity to be for itself. We can remember what Springfield cannot remember. We can see what Springfield cannot see. And maybe, in that seeing, we can find something that makes it matter, that makes the 30 years of this show's running, all the specific choices and accumulated details and layered mysteries, into something more than a loop that we love and maintain and cannot break. Maybe the thing we find is simply this: recognition. The recognition that the systems we have been examining in Springfield are not unique to Springfield, that the dynamics we have been tracing in a fictional contaminated town are present in the real world in forms that are slightly less dramatic and slightly less cartoonish, but recognizably related. We watch Springfield because we recognize it. We recognize it because we live in it, and living in it, watching it, seeing it as clearly as this examination has tried to see it, maybe that is itself a form of the thing Springfield lacks, a form of awareness, a refusal to do the forgetting that the system requires. Springfield forgets so that it can continue. We remember so that we can change. That is the final thought. That is the thing that 30 years of this show, examined from the outside, has been building toward without quite committing to say. The loop is real. The patterns are real. The mechanisms are real. And so is the capacity to see them. So is this. End of section 22. Complete script end. Title: 5 Hours of Unknown Simpsons. Mysteries so disturbing the writers refuse to address them. Total sections: 22. Section 23. The Simpson family's impossible finances, the economic paradox at the heart of the show. Homer Simpson earns, according to various canonical references across the show's run, somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 per year. These figures have shifted as the show's floating timeline has moved forward, and as the show's internal economics have required different, specific numbers for different plot purposes. But the general range is consistent. Homer earns a working-class income from a working-class job, somewhere in the lower middle tier of American wage earners. On this income, Homer supports a family of 5 living in a 2-story house in a residential neighborhood, maintains 2 cars, goes to a bar regularly enough to be considered a regular, takes vacations, attends professional sporting events, pursues expensive hobbies, replaces household items destroyed through negligence or accident with remarkable frequency, and navigates the various financial emergencies that are generated by his own impulsivity and the general chaos of life in Springfield. The numbers do not work. This is not a controversial observation. The show itself has acknowledged it in multiple episodes, where the Simpson family's finances are the subject of explicit discussion. There are episodes where Homer and Marge confront the reality of their financial situation with a seriousness that is briefly genuine before the episode's comic needs reassert themselves. There are episodes where the gap between their income and their lifestyle is the direct engine of the plot. But across the entire run of the show, the Simpsons maintain a lifestyle that is inconsistent with Homer's documented income, and the show has never produced a coherent accounting of how this is possible. The standard answer is that the show is not attempting economic realism, that the Simpsons' finances are as loosely depicted as everything else in Springfield, that the house and the cars and the vacations are there because the show needs them there, not because they follow from any careful accounting of what Homer's job would actually pay. This is correct. And it is also, as we have established in the context of every other apparently straightforward Springfield anomaly, not the complete picture. Because the Simpsons' financial situation is not just vaguely inconsistent in the way that a show indifferent to economic realism would produce, it is inconsistent in specific ways that cluster around specific features. The house is always there, the cars are always available, the catastrophic expenses generated by Homer's impulsivity are always absorbed. The family never loses the house, never faces the specific kind of financial ruin that Homer's behavior would realistically produce. There is a floor. The Simpsons always hit the floor and bounce back. The specific catastrophes that would, in a realistic account of their finances, produce irreversible damage, bankruptcy, foreclosure, the permanent loss of the middle-class lifestyle that the show establishes as the family's baseline never quite materialize. Why is there a floor? The show has offered several partial explanations across its run. Homer has received windfalls, inheritances, settlements from various accidents and legal disputes. The family has occasionally been supported by extended family in ways that provided temporary financial stabilization. There are episodes where the resolution of a specific financial crisis is provided by a deus ex machina that the show acknowledges as a deus ex machina rather than pretending it follows from any plausible financial logic. But none of these explanations account for the consistency of the floor, the reliable bottom below which the Simpsons' financial situation never falls, regardless of the specific scale of the catastrophe that should push them below it. In the context of everything we have established about Springfield's power structures, one explanation is worth considering: the deal. We know, from the show's own mythology, that Grandpa Simpson struck a deal with Mr. Burns at some point in the past, a deal whose specific terms guaranteed Homer's continued employment at the plant regardless of his performance. This deal is canonical. It is the show's own explanation for why Homer has not been permanently fired despite an employment record that would have ended any normal person's career at the plant within their first month. But a deal that guarantees employment is also, implicitly, a deal that guarantees income. And a deal that guarantees income from Springfield's primary employer, the employer whose relationship to Springfield's economic and civic life is as total as Mr. Burns's is depicted as being, might also, explicitly or implicitly, guarantee a certain minimum standard of material existence for the employee and his family. Burns needs Homer in Sector 7G. Homer needs to be stable enough to continue showing up to Sector 7G. A catastrophically financially destabilized Homer, one facing homelessness, one whose family has fractured under the weight of financial collapse, is a Homer who might do something unpredictable, might look for other employment, might, in the specific desperation of genuine financial crisis, become motivated to understand what he is actually doing at the plant and why he is being kept there. A financially stable Homer is a Homer who keeps showing up, day after day, to sit in his chair and watch his lights and push his buttons and understand nothing. The floor under the Simpson family's finances is part of the mechanism that keeps Homer in Sector 7G. It is the specific material provision that makes his indefinite continuation in that role possible. This is speculation. The show has never made this connection explicitly, but the show has established all the components. The deal that guarantees Homer's employment, Burns's interest in maintaining that employment, Homer's specific function in Sector 7G, and the floor under the Simpson family's finances that has persisted through 30 years of catastrophic financial behavior. Put those components together, and the economic paradox of the Simpsons' lifestyle resolves into something coherent. The floor is there because someone is maintaining it. The Simpsons don't lose the house because losing the house would disturb the arrangement that someone with resources and motivation is invested in maintaining. Homer sits in his chair at the plant. The family sits in the house on Evergreen Terrace. The bills get paid, somehow, despite everything. The floor holds, the arrangement continues. Burns gets what he needs from Sector 7G. Homer gets what his family needs to survive in Springfield. The deal holds, generation after generation, invisible and unnamed, maintained by the specific mechanics of mutual dependency that characterize so many of Springfield's invisible arrangements. The numbers still don't work. They were never meant to work. But the floor is there. It has always been there. And now that you know to look for it, you can see it in every episode where The Simpsons' financial catastrophe resolves without the catastrophic consequences it should produce. The floor holds, the deal holds, Springfield continues. End of Section 23. Section 24. Closing thoughts: the show that knows itself and the audience that enables it. There is a specific thing that happens when a cultural object runs long enough. It begins, inevitably, to accumulate an awareness of itself. An awareness that is not designed into it by its creators, but that emerges from the sheer mass of its own history, from the weight of the choices that have been made across its long run, from the accumulation of patterns that were never individually intended to be patterns, but that become visible at sufficient scale. The Simpsons is, in the history of American television, the object that has had the most time to accumulate this self-awareness. It has been running for more than 30 years. It has produced more episodes than any other scripted primetime show in the history of the medium. It has generated more analysis, more fan documentation, more cultural commentary, more academic attention than almost any other piece of American entertainment. And it has, in the process of all this accumulation, become aware of itself in ways that its earliest episodes could not have anticipated. Not aware in the simple sense of being self-referential, the show has been self-referential since its earliest seasons, breaking the fourth wall, acknowledging its own nature as a constructed artifact, but aware in a deeper sense, aware of what it has become, of what it reveals about itself when examined from the outside over sufficient time, of what the accumulated record of its choices says about the world it has been depicting. The show knows that Springfield is a closed system. It demonstrates this awareness every time it does a self-referential episode that acknowledges the loop, every time it makes a joke about the characters not aging, every time it depicts Springfield's collective amnesia as the specific mechanism it is rather than as a simple narrative convenience. The awareness is there, distributed across the show's history in the specific places where the comedy opens up enough to let something more serious through. What the show does with that awareness is more complicated. It doesn't resolve it. It doesn't use the awareness as a pathway toward actually changing the things the awareness reveals. It uses the awareness as comedy as another source of the specific knowing, self-referential humor that has been one of the show's most reliable modes. The awareness becomes a gag rather than a reckoning. This is the show's most fundamental choice, the choice that has defined its entire long run, the choice to frame everything as comedy rather than as anything else. And it is a choice that has preserved the show's accessibility and its audience across decades, and it is also a choice that has, perhaps, prevented the show from ever quite doing what its accumulated self-awareness would most radically allow it to do. Which is to say, what if Springfield could change? Not in the flash-forward sense, where the future is depicted as different, but the present continues unchanged. Not in the deus ex machina sense, where a specific problem is resolved through a specific plot device that leaves everything else intact. But in the fundamental sense, what if the loop broke? What if Bart aged past 10? What if Lisa's intelligence finally found an audience capable of responding to it? What if Homer's moment of unimpaired clarity, that one episode where the crayon was removed and he was briefly the person he could have been, was the ending of the show rather than one episode in its middle? This is not the show we have. This is the show that the accumulated weight of 30 years of the show we have suggests might be possible. The show's own imagination has glimpsed it in the flash-forwards, in the moments of genuine emotion that the comedy briefly allows, in the specific episodes where the frame opens wide enough to let something through that isn't a joke. We will probably never see it. The economics of the show's continuation require the premise to remain intact. The audience for the show is the audience for Springfield as it is, not Springfield as it might become. And the love that the audience has for Springfield is the specific love that does not want the thing it loves to change, that finds in Springfield's eternal present a comfort that any resolution would destroy. But the possibility exists. The show's own history contains it, and the examination we have been conducting, across these 24 sections, is itself a kind of engagement with that possibility, a refusal to simply accept the surface, a willingness to look at the accumulated evidence and see what it says about the world beneath the comedy. Springfield is what it is. It has always been what it is. It will continue to be what it is for as long as we watch it, and as long as we love it, and as long as we need it to be home. But we have looked at it carefully now. We have seen what 30 years of looking the other way has kept invisible. We have assembled the picture that no individual episode was designed to produce, but that all of them together have produced anyway. And having seen it, having done this specific work of looking and assembling and refusing to move on, we are slightly less capable of watching without seeing. Slightly more aware of the water and the ward and the shadow government and the children who disappeared and the man in the crowd scene with the smile that has nothing to do with joy. The show will continue. Springfield will continue. The loop will loop. But the knowing is real. The seeing is real. And you cannot unsee what you have seen. Welcome back to Springfield. We hope you enjoyed your stay. End of section 24. End of complete script. 5 hours of unknown Simpsons. Mysteries so disturbing. The writers refuse to address them. Complete voiceover script. Total sections, 24. Bonus. The question that started everything and the one the show has never answered. We have now spent a considerable amount of time in Springfield. We have looked at it from angles that the show itself declines to look from, assembled evidence that no individual episode was designed to assemble, traced patterns across 3 decades of storytelling that were never individually intended to form patterns. We have been the kind of viewer that Springfield's own residents are incapable of being. The viewer who pays attention, who remembers, who connects. And having done all of this work, there is one question that I want to return to, the question that started this entire examination and that has been present in the background of every section we have covered. The question is not who shot Mr. Burns, it is not where Springfield is located, it is not what is actually in Sector 7G or what Patty and Selma know or what Homer's job actually consists of. The question is simpler and older than any of these. It is the question that any viewer who has watched the show with genuine attention and genuine love has eventually felt pressing against the edge of their engagement with it. Why do the characters never seem to know how lucky they are? This sounds like a sentimental question, and in a certain register it is, but it is also a genuine mystery about the show's emotional logic. The Simpsons are, for all their dysfunction and impairment and systematic exposure to forces that have damaged them in ways we have spent 24 sections documenting, a family that has each other. They have a house, they have food, they have the specific daily texture of a shared life, the arguments, the reconciliations, the small kindnesses, the larger failures, the Sunday dinners, and the couch, and the television, and the particular warmth of a family that, for all its chaos, keeps showing up for each other. This is not nothing. In the world the show depicts, in a world with a contaminated water supply, and a shadow government, and a failing school, and a psychiatric ward, cycling the same patients through the same inadequate treatments, having a family that loves you, imperfectly but genuinely, is not something that every Springfield resident has. There are Springfield residents who are alone. There are Springfield residents who are isolated by poverty or illness, or the specific varieties of social marginalization that the show has depicted across its run. There are Springfield residents for whom the Simpson family's dysfunctional house on Evergreen Terrace would represent an unimaginable abundance of human connection. Homer never knows this. Bart rarely knows this. Even Lisa, with her extraordinary capacity for perception, is so caught up in the gap between what is and what should be that she sometimes misses what actually is. The question of why they don't know is connected to everything we have examined. It is connected to the environmental impairment that prevents the kind of reflective cognition that would allow them to hold their own lives at a distance and see them clearly. It is connected to the institutional failures that have given them no models for gratitude, no practices for noticing the specific gifts that are present in their ordinary daily lives. It is connected to the show's own comic register, which requires the characters to suffer and fail and be frustrated by their situation rather than to appreciate it, because appreciation does not generate comedy in the same way that frustration does. But it is also connected to something more fundamental about how human beings in general, not just Springfield human beings, relate to their ordinary lives. The tendency to notice the gap between what is and what should be is universal. The tendency to take for granted the specific gifts that are present while fixating on the specific absences is almost universal. The inability to see one's own life with the clarity that allows genuine appreciation of what is actually there, rather than chronic attention to what is not. This is not unique to Springfield. This is a feature of human consciousness that the show has been depicting with accuracy for 30 years. The Springfield residents are impaired versions of ordinary human beings. The impairment exaggerates certain tendencies that all human beings share. And the tendency to not know how lucky you are to be in the middle of a life that contains genuine gifts, and to be unable to see those gifts clearly because of the constant pull of the things that are wrong is one of the tendencies the show has been exaggerating and depicting and making visible through comedy for its entire run. This is the final thing the show is about, underneath everything else. Underneath the contaminated water and the shadow government and the psychiatric ward and all the rest of it, the show is about people who have each other and don't quite know it. Who are together on a couch in a house and don't quite feel it. Who are loved imperfectly but genuinely, and are too impaired by the specific forms of damage that their world has inflicted on them to rest in that love without it slipping away. That is the tragedy at the center of the comedy. That is the weight beneath the joke. That is why the show has been running for 30 years, and why it will keep running, and why we keep watching, and why we feel, in the specific warmth of returning to Springfield, something that is not just entertainment but closer to what the characters feel without knowing they feel it. We love them. They love each other. Nobody knows how lucky that makes them. Springfield keeps going. We keep watching. The loop holds. And the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is lit from within against the Springfield night, and inside the family is together, and the television is on, and Bart and Lisa are watching Itchy and Scratchy, and Homer is on the couch, and Marge is in the kitchen, and Maggie is in her high chair, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting. The family is together. The light is on. The night is outside. For now, that is enough. For now, it is always enough. End of complete script. Narrator's note on the tone of this script. This script is written to be delivered slowly. Not laboriously, not with false gravity, but with the specific pace of someone who is thinking through what they are saying as they say it, who is not rushing to the next point because the point they are currently on deserves to be felt before being left behind. The tone throughout is curious rather than conspiratorial. We are not making accusations. We are not claiming that anyone in the production of The Simpsons intended the patterns we have documented. We are observing what 30 years of creative work has produced, assembled from the outside, by people who love the show and have spent enough time with it to see what it says when you look at all of it at once rather than one episode at a time. The show deserves that kind of attention. Few shows in the history of American television have earned it more. There are moments in this script that should be allowed to breathe, moments where a pause serves the observation being made more than any additional words would. Trust those moments. The audience will feel the weight of what has been said if you let the air around it do its work. There are also moments of genuine warmth, particularly toward the end of the script, where the observation shifts from the darkness to something more complicated. The recognition that what makes Springfield disturbing is inseparable from what makes it beloved. Those moments should be delivered with the specific quality of someone who means what they are saying, who is not ironizing the affection, who genuinely loves the thing they have spent this video examining carefully. Because the love and the examination are not in opposition. The best criticism, the most genuine engagement with any work of art comes from love. It comes from caring enough about something to look at it honestly, to see it clearly, to hold both its gifts and its failures without needing to pretend that either negates the other. That is this script's relationship to The Simpsons. We see it clearly because we love it. We love it because it has given us 30 years of reasons to look carefully. And what we have found in all that looking, all the patterns, all the accumulated evidence, all the mysteries and the mechanisms and the machinery running beneath the comedy is ultimately a portrait of something true, of people trying to be a family in a world that makes being a family very difficult, of a community trying to hold itself together under pressures that it cannot name and cannot escape and cannot do anything about except keep going and hope that the things that are holding get held. That is The Simpsons. That is what 30 years of episodes, assembled and examined, ultimately reveals. The family keeps going, the world keeps being difficult, the comedy keeps working, and we keep watching, because we love them, because they are us, because Springfield is home. Deliver this script as if you mean it, because you do.